How should we live in this world? One way of approaching that, something I think I've made the mistake of doing in the past, is to think of oneself as a player, someone whose consequences have an impact on this world. You will do ABC, you will achieve XYZ, and things will change and you will be happy. But too often, this way of thinking can bring about anxiety and suffering. As I grow older, I've also become a bit more humble and a bit more aware of the limits of my ability. A great way to deal with the world and to understand it and to navigate it is to be an impartial spectator. This is a phrase coined by Adam Smith, and my guest today reminded me of it. And I think this is not just an excellent philosophy for a journalist, it is also the route to personal happiness. The Buddha would approve. Watch the world closely, but don't get emotionally involved in tribal thinking. Be equanimous, for everything will pass.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen, our weekly podcast on economics, politics, and behavioral science. Please welcome your host, Amit Varma.
Welcome to The Seen and the Unseen. My guest today is Niranjan Rajadhyaksha, a man who is like an elder statesman in three domains in India: journalism, policy, and economics. Niranjan started out as a young buck in economic journalism, rose to the top of his field, mentored many writers and columnists through the years. Indeed, he gave me my first weekly column in a mainstream newspaper, and then moved to the world of policy. He is now an executive director at Artha Global, and many people I know think of him as their personal Dronacharya. His wisdom stems from more than just his journalistic and policy experience. So, both his parents are legends in the world of Marathi culture, and he is steeped in that world as well. As you will hear in this conversation, he's a man of many parts, and there is much to learn from him. But before you get that rare honor, let's take a quick commercial break. Do you want to read more? I've put in a lot of work in recent years in building a reading habit. This means that I read more books, but I also read more long-form articles and essays. There's a world of knowledge available through the internet, but the problem we all face is, how do we navigate this knowledge? How do we know what to read? How do we put the right incentives in place? Well, I discovered one way. A couple of friends of mine run this awesome company called CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com, which aims to help people up-level themselves by reading more. A few months ago, I signed up for one of their programs called The Daily Reader. Every day for 6 months, they sent me a long-form article to read. The subjects covered went from machine learning to mythology to mental models and marmalade. This helped me build a habit of reading. At the end of every day, I understood the world a little better than I did before. So if you want to build your reading habit, head on over to CTQ Compounds and check out their Daily Reader. New batches start every month. They also have a great program called Future Stack, which helps you stay up to date with ideas, skills, and mental models that will help you stay relevant in the future. Future Stack batches start every Saturday. What's more, you get a discount of a whopping 2,500 rupees, 2,500 if you use the discount code UNSEEN. So head on over to CTQ Compounds at ctqcompounds.com and use the code UNSEEN. Up-level yourself. Niranjan, welcome to The Seen and the Unseen.
Thank you, Amit. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, we've been planning this for so long. I've known you for so many years. I think 2007 is when we
First met.
And so it's a pleasure to finally be doing this 17 years later. And as in a sense, there's a passing of so much time. I want to ask you a question by first quoting from what you have earlier somewhere else spoken of as one of your favorite books, which is Peter Drucker's The Adventures of a Bystander. And I'll just read this bit out before I get to my question. And Drucker writes, quote, "Bystanders have no history of their own. They are on the stage but are not part of the action. They are not even audience. The fortunes of the play and of every actor in it depend on the audience, whereas the reaction of the bystander has no effect except on himself. But standing in the wings, much like the fireman in the theatre, the bystander sees things neither the actor nor audience notices. Above all, he sees differently from the way actors or audiences see. Bystanders reflect, and reflection is a prism rather than a mirror. It refracts." Stop quote. And beautiful words. And you said this at the start of a talk, which I'll also link from the show notes. And while quoting from this, you mentioned that you saw yourself as a bit of a bystander also. And I want to ask a bit about that, because just reflecting on my own life, I think I have realized that as time goes by, however much you want to be an actor, you realize after a point in time that there is that you are a bystander in most things, that there is value to being a bystander, and the value can't be underestimated. And that is one way in which I kind of contextualized it to myself. But even otherwise, when I look at the bare bones of your biography, and we'll double click on it in much more length, your parents in a sense were actors. They also did their bystanding, but they were actors. They played their part, and are sort of remembered for that. In a lot of what I have seen you do from a distance, whether it is as an editor in journalism where you're quietly in the background mentoring people, commissioning pieces, or whether it is even as part of the policy ecosystem where you're on the board of advisors of this, helping universities set curricula, etc., it's almost as if you have mastered that art of being a bystander and taken that role upon yourself. So I'll ask you to elaborate on this, right? When you said
Yeah, so I would agree with you. I think temperamentally I am a bystander, Perhaps you can put it down to a certain inborn element of laziness. So I maybe, I'm the guy who stands at the boundary line and watches cricketers rather than actually takes the trouble.
I'm the Bengali here. You Marathis can't compete with us on laziness.
Yeah. Right. So the polite word is being laid back, I suppose. But more seriously, this Peter Drucker book actually struck me a lot. It really resonated with me, this image of the bystander. And if you remember that book, in the beginning, he explains what he means by this. And it's in, I think, 1912 or 1913 in Vienna, at the height of the old Austro-Hungarian Empire. I think it's the emperor's birthday. And there's this march past. And, there was a lot of prestige to which student of the school held the flag, And Peter Drucker says that after a lot of attempts, I was given the honor of, holding the flag for the march past, which the emperor would take. And halfway through, he suddenly says that this is not his game, and he turns around and he gives the flag to somebody else and then walks past and stands in the audience, and he says, that is when I realized that I was temperamentally a bystander. I agree. There are certain advantages of being a bystander. There's a certain distance. Another imagery which has sort of deeply resonated with me is what Adam Smith writes about as the impartial spectator, So a lot of people I know say that people who write should have skin in the game. And I can see where they're coming from. But I think the way Adam Smith puts it, that there is an impartial spectator who almost, the distance itself is his advantage. And I think, in fact, I, for some years in Mint Lounge, wrote a column called Impartial Spectator. And then, as luck would have it, our dear friend Shruti Rajagopalan also wrote a column called Impartial Spectator. So I think that's another idea which appeals to me. So yeah, it's interesting. In my years as a writer on economics and economic policy, I've had two responses, especially when I'm writing on current affairs, from people in government, because I largely write on macro policy. So it's the RBI, the Finance Ministry, Niti Aayog. One set of responses has been that, hey, you guys, or you specifically, you write what the pure version of a policy should be. You don't understand that it's difficult, that we face constraints, etc. So that's the classic thing, that you guys don't have skin in the game. What you're writing is fine in a perfect world, but that's not how it works. But on the other hand, I've also had senior bureaucrats, policymakers tell me an exactly opposite, give an opposite reaction, which is that, hey, don't, you write what should be. How it is going to be done, let us manage the politics, So I think there has been, in a way, a skin in the game sort of response and bystander or impartial spectator response. So I think there is value in both, in people who write as if they were insiders and people who write as they were outsiders. I'm comfortable being an outsider. I think it adds some perspective, a different view of the world, And in fact, if you remember in that last scene of the Ratatouille, that film, where the critic has his monologue about what the food critic brings to the table. I think I sort of identify with some of those thoughts.
And what you just stated so beautifully, skin in the game versus the impartial Spectator. Another way I used to sometimes think about it is of, the Overton window. Like, where are you in the game? If you can be an outsider where you are just trying to shift the Overton window and taking the pure position and laying that way out, or you can be sort of, within the game, you're an insider and you're just pushing from the margins and trying to make things happen there. But in a sense, like, I've always seen myself as the person ranting on the outside, the Overton window shifter. You are not quite that. You are much more nuanced in a sense. You don't have the activist urge that I must shift the window. Rather, you have the truth seeker urge of let's find out what works and how it works and all of that.
Yeah, I suppose that would be a fair comment. I try to bring on board what the constraints people making policy are facing. But again, as an outsider, I don't think that, at least there are various ways of writing on economics or on economic policy. I don't see my way as trying to think like a insider. It is going to be an outsider's perspective, but with due respect to the fact that people do. And in fact, one of my favorite economists, Avinash Dikshit, had this great line saying that the second best is actually the best. So in the world of economics, you have this first best world or the pure world of frictionless trade and perfect information, perfect competition, and then you have the real messy world. So I try to take the messy world on board, but I would like to push the envelope every now and then.
Is there an element of realizing that the first best is unachievable and therefore the second best is the best in the context of one's personal journey as well? Like, and again, sorry, another question about aging, because I just, I've had reason to think about it a lot recently, but it's, in the sense that when you go through life, when you're young, you're full of passion and energy and all of that. You are always thinking of the first best for yourself, right? And as time passes and the years and the decades kind of slip by, you sometimes realize that first best isn't even the first best. That there's no need to go for that shit. And you, come to peace with your role in the world and what you want to do and all of that. Have you made, is there that kind of an arc in your life?
I think so, because I think you, rather than make peace, I think you learn as you go that the world is more complex than you started off in your 20s, right? And I think complexity is different from being complicated. Complicated is different. There are too many moving parts in the real world, And again, if I may use a quote which has always stuck with me. So there is this essay which John Maynard Keynes wrote on his teacher, Alfred Marshall, where I think this is the essay in which Keynes cites something which Marshall wrote. And Marshall says that when I began my life as an economist, I had more answers than questions. And as at this stage of my life, when I'm, wrapping up my career, I have more questions than answers. And I think there is something profound there, which, I try to learn from that. You learn to be modest. And I think, sometimes the questions interest you more than just the quick answers.
Let's, go to biography now and talk about your childhood. So tell me about your childhood. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so I'm a hardcore Mumbaiker, right? I've been brought up in Mumbai. I've stayed almost my entire life in this city, a city I love. It can be exasperating at times, but nevertheless, there is an undercurrent of affection for my city. So I had a pretty privileged childhood, and I don't mean privilege in the financial sense. It was very much a middle class existence, but privileged in the cultural sense. My parents, both my parents, were very famous Marathi writers. My father passed away many years ago, and my mother has stopped writing. She's now 90. But at their peak, they were, highly respected. They're still respected. So I grew up in that milieu, and just to give a bit of background, my father was a professor of English at Elphinstone College. He also taught in a few other colleges in Bombay, in Ahmedabad, etc. And he was a bilingual writer. So he wrote both in English and Marathi, which was quite common at that point of time, bilingualism. And he was largely a critic. He wrote some very celebrated books on Marathi poetry and history of Marathi literature. He was also an essayist, a humorist. He wrote on cricket a lot because he was a big fan of cricket. And he was one of those people in the 1940s, Marathi literature took a turn, towards modernism. So it's like in Hindi, you had the Nai Kahani movement. We had this Navakatha and Kavita movements. And I think my father was in the forefront of the people who actually, backed this shift. And later also when the rural and Dalit poetry came in, I think my parents saw the importance of both these trends much earlier than many people. So that was my father. My mother was a professor of Marathi, again at Elphinstone College. And my mother began her career as a short story writer in Marathi. And she was one of those writers in the 60s, 70s, like broadly in the early decades of post-independent India, who wrote a lot on the dilemmas of female life. So the female body, female sexuality, female, life in general, everything. And I think great appreciation. She then also became a critic. She wrote some very celebrated books on Marathi poetry, and her PhD thesis was on the modernist poet Rajadhyaksha, who broadly you could say is like the T.S. Eliot of Marathi. Means he turned the direction of Marathi poetry, and that won the Sahitya Academy Award. Then my mother also became the president of the Marathi Sahitya Sammelan, which is the annual literary conference, and that's a very prestigious position. So so the point is that I grew up in this family with two very celebrated writers. So one thing which it meant is naturally I grew up in a house full of books, and English books, Marathi books. And because my mother wanted to watch Satyajit Ray without subtitles, and she wanted to read Camus without, in his own language, she actually even picked up some Bengali and French. So there were some Bengali and French books also. So this was true, so this, perhaps this, passion for ideas, I think it came by growing up in a house full of books. I think the other thing which now when I look back, Amit, is that in those years, your formative years, some of Maharashtra's most celebrated writers, poets, thinkers, social activists were coming and going out of our house, So in a way, I got to see at a very young age people of great achievement, So I think that keeps you rooted, means you don't judge yourself too highly when you've seen these people from a very young age. So I think that was, and not just Marathi, I think my parents had, the pan-India connection. So you are Anantamurthy, Bhairappa, Umashankar Joshi, Kartar Singh Duggal, lots of writers from other parts of India also were close to my parents. So yeah, it was in that sense when I said it was a privileged childhood, it was this. And if I may continue, so this was the house, but we were also living in a housing society of writers, So just about everyone in this society called Sahitya Sahas is, most of them are no longer there with us, but they are of that same type, means writers, professors, thinkers, etc. Interestingly, our entire lane was interesting because all this, all the societies in that lane, like ours was a writers' colony, then there was a Patrakar Nagar, there was a colony of architects, there was a colony of artists. So the Thakres, for example, were our neighbors. Also, they were in Kalanagar and a lot of other very famous artists. So in that sense, that entire stretch and our colony was very active, in terms of achievement and ideas. And like a sidebar, so to say, it's interesting that in this entire world of artists and writers and journalists and architects and scientists also, out come some economists, So in this lane was where I grew up. Ajay Shah grew up, Mahesh Vyas grew up, Ratin Roy grew up, and Rupa Nitsuri grew up,
Wow.
So it's interesting that 5 economists from my generation, it just so happened, grew up in this lane. So it was great fun.
There's a lot I want to double click on. I mean, we'll just speak about this period for a long, long time now. And I want to sort of start with your parents one by one. Like, what I found fascinating while reading about them was the sort of the multiculturalism. Not only were they deeply steeped in Marathi, but your dad actually taught English at Elphinstone, at Gujarat College in Ahmedabad, Rajaram College in Kolhapur, etc., etc. And there's a beautiful pithy obituary of his, which came in the TOI, which describes him thus. It says, quote, eminent critic, essayist, and erstwhile professor of English, Mangesh Vittal Rajadhyaksha died on Monday at the age of 96 after a brief illness. His essays collected in 7 volumes brought to Marathi literary criticism a rare perspicacity, candor, and impatience with cant. His style was economical, precise, and always lined with irony. He also co-authored a seminal history of Marathi literature with Kusumvati Deshpande, and then it goes on. And in Lok Satta, in an editorial, it described his death as a death of a Puran Purush. Forgive my pronunciations, but a Puran Purush, which, was someone who was a scholar in both the English critical tradition as well as a Marathi intellectual, right? Almost in my mind, like, I obviously with my Western lens translate everything. So for me, therefore, a Renaissance man with wide-ranging interests across languages and subjects. And I want to sort of ask about this because this seems to me to be like the greatest form of privilege possible. Like, I did an episode with Sugata Srinivasa Raju, where he introduced me to the term rooted cosmopolitanism, right? And my lament was that I am cosmopolitan, yes, but I'm not really rooted enough. And reading about your dad, what struck me was that he was not just a rooted cosmopolitan, obviously, but even that cosmopolitanness was deeply rooted. Because he was actually teaching English literature. He was, writing about Shakespeare in India and how it plays over, writing all of these incredible books on the culture and all of that. So give me a sense of, give me a deeper sense of what it meant to grow up with all of these books around you, not just in English, but also Marathi, and an equal respect for both. Yeah. Like, I grew up surrounded by English books, but I also inherited for a while the snobbish attitude that this is it, Western learning, Western culture is the pinnacle, and which is a horrible thing that happened because my understanding of all other cultures to this day is much more superficial, So give me a sense of what that was like what languages would you converse in, what was sort of, what was the discourse at home, and what would you read? Were you reading in both languages equally?
No, thanks. So it's interesting, what you just read about my father, and I think it's a fair reflection of his attitude towards life. I think he thought Western learning and Indian culture were both important, and in our case, Marathi culture. So his great friend P.L. Deshpande, who's perhaps the iconic cultural figure in Maharashtra and a very close friend of my father's, he wrote an essay on my father many years ago, maybe 50, 60 years ago. And where one thing he says is that, my father was equally at home with Tukaram and John Donne, with Ram Ganesh Gadkari and Shakespeare. So I think my father perfectly kept his feet in both worlds. And I think, it's interesting that perhaps he was not the only one. Many years ago, I remember Ramchandra Guha had written a piece on bilingual intellectuals, and at that point of time, there were so many of them, means Dr. Harivansh Rai Bachchan, Firaq Gorakhpuri, lots of these writers across the country who could write with equal ease in both their mother tongue and in English, and I think perhaps that's something which is dying out, unfortunately, in India. The second thing actually is that my father was also very fluent in Gujarati, for various reasons. So in a way, he knew two Indian languages also very well. He never wrote in Gujarati, but he would sometimes, write to his friends in Gujarati, but he spoke Gujarati very fluently. So I think that experience broadened my horizons. So at home, it was Marathi, definitely. And as I said, in my colony, so I actually went to an English school. And I think there's a lot of thing that if your parents were Marathi writers, why did you end up in an English school? There's an entire story behind that. I went to a South Mumbai college, but when I came back into my housing society, it was always Marathi was spoken, with my friends, with everything. So I think I, in a way, also implicitly grew up with my, one part of my life in cosmopolitan Mumbai, one in very middle class Marathi Mumbai, and both enriched me. So I really don't want to see this as a binary. I'm grateful for what both these worlds have given me. I think that is the key thing, that what happens is that I sometimes fear that because we've lost, at least large parts of the elite have lost touch with their languages, I think we are losing a connect with a lot of, sensibility, culture, thinking which is rooted in the Indian soil, and no culture can be completely divorced from that place's soil, soil metaphorically I'm saying, obviously. So I think that was important. I actually, did not read much Marathi when I was in school and college. I did read some stuff in college. My Marathi reading actually caught up much later, when I think I can say with confidence I'm a pretty fluent Marathi speaker, to the extent that even today I can give an entire lecture on economics in Marathi. But Marathi reading picked up a little later when I became more conscious of the fact that, hey, I'm reading so many English books, why am I not reading Marathi books? And in the early days, so I would say, perhaps in my late 30s, I decided, which is about 20 years ago, if I have to give away my age now. And I sort of made a conscious decision that I should read more Marathi. And my wife, Saili, she studied in the Marathi school. So she reads more Marathi than English. I read more English than Marathi. But I think she also, then gave me a lot of, new stuff to read. So the reading came a little later, but knowledge and speaking in Marathi was right from my childhood.
I also want to ask you about another aspect which fascinates me, and Peggy Mohan first opened my eyes to it in her episode with me, where she spoke about the distinction between being bilingual and being diglossic. And being diglossic is really when you might know two languages, but each language is restricted to its context. So at home, you might think and speak in, whatever your language is, in my case, Bengali perhaps. But at work, you are always in English. So you will never think about economics in Bengali. You won't even be able to express it. And you, of course, won't, because you don't know Bengali, but even otherwise, and so on. So what is the relationship there between these two? Like, are you always code shifting, when you sort of shift from one language to the other? Are the contexts different, or do they flow into each other easily?
Wow, that's an interesting question. I haven't actually thought about it, so let me bullshit my way through this one. I think I haven't thought about this, but I think I shift seamlessly between them. So sometimes, for example, simple thing is when you're counting, sometimes I find myself counting in English, sometimes in Marathi. So maybe that's a very basic way of thinking about it. So there is this dichotomy in our lives, because English is the language we speak during most of our professional lives. Hindi is important because it is the language which is most commonly spoken in India. So today I took an Uber. Obviously, I spoke to the Uber driver in Hindi. But I think that I'm actually both. I really don't think in only English or only Marathi. It depends. It's not just about who I am with. Sometimes it's just my mind drifts into either English or Marathi. Thankfully not Hindi, because as you know, Mumbaikar Hindi is awful.
Mumbaikar spontaneous order was you. How do you say spontaneous order in Marathi?
Arre baapre. No, that's a tough one. I thought you were going to ask me simple questions. not tell your listeners how stupid I am.
No, because just moments ago you said that you gave a full lecture on economics in Marathi. No, I'm kidding.
Technical words are always a challenge. So yeah, I'll come back with that.
Yeah. So, your erstwhile neighbor, your still neighbor, Ajay, and obviously my co-host for the YouTube show I do, he told me something months ago, which I have been thinking about since, and which sort of, got me thinking. And that was about studies done by Jim Heckman, where Heckman, essentially Nobel Prize winning economist, you've obviously must have read all his work. So for the sake of the listeners, so what Heckman essentially finds, to put it simply, is that a child's most important developmental years are between 0 to 5, because the brain kind of comes out of the womb kind of small, and then it's expanding, it's exploding. I think 1 million neurons a second or some shit like that for the first 5 years, and then it slows down massively. So the development you get in the first 5 years is everything. And one of Heckman's studies apparently shows that kids who grow up listening to 10-letter words around them, which you can think of as a proxy for complicated discourse, for evolved discourse, have this extra layer of cognitive ability that other kids don't have. Right. And you cannot, if you miss that between 0 to 5, you cannot get that in future. You cannot do adult learning for something like that, because it's just that extra layer which is there. And Ajay's point was that this is a layer of privilege we all ignore. We think of money, but even in a well-to-do family, like in a nouveau-riche family or whatever, you may not be surrounded by books. You may not have those kind of conversations, and therefore you miss out on that layer completely. And I am now just sort of thinking aloud and riffing, but thinking that in a family that is as deeply bilingual, where you are literally getting 10-letter words in 2 languages, I think the advantage that you get, and even if you don't want to call it an advantage, the difference that you get in the way that you see the world from others who don't have that privilege is kind of enormous, right? And I was just thinking aloud this morning and thinking that today we are in a globalized world where languages can speak to each other in a sense. But for most of human history, every language and every culture was reinventing the wheel in a sense, like what is art, what is literature, what frame do you apply to it? Everything is evolving from within a tradition in an indigenous way, in a language or a dialect. And today, okay, it's a melting pot, and you can apply, a Western cinema lens to a Bollywood film and say, hey, Shah Rukh Khan can't act, which of course he can't, but without realizing that that's a complete category error, So when you think back on that, what do you sort of think of that? Because I would imagine that if you compare somebody like you with somebody of your age, growing up in the same economic affluence or circumstances, whatever that was, but without either of these languages, you are just looking at the world very differently. And this is something I've noticed even with, of the economists who've been on my show, or the thinkers who've been on my show. I just find that the people who've grown up reading Hindi or whatever the local language is just think really differently. People like Suyash Rai, Rahul Verma, they just see things that their purely English speaking colleagues like me, don't grok at all. So what sort of your sense?
No, so Heckman, of course, has done really fantastic work. I think in a country like India, also basic nutrition also makes a big difference, So, but many years ago, I had read a piece in the New York Times where they made the same point about what you're making, that bilingualism actually gives you long-term cognitive advantage, and I think there is something to it. Of course, it doesn't mean that somebody brought up with one tradition or one language is necessarily not intelligent. But I think bilingualism, as far as I am concerned, as I said, it has given me exposure to a very different sensibility, and I think as far as the Marathi world of ideas goes, and I think that's been of immense value to me. The other thing, Amit, is that I feel that, there's no need to have a hierarchy of languages, that English is better, Marathi is better, Hindi is better. I think people can be naturally multilingual. Means I've always been fascinated by areas where actually there is multilingualism in the air, so to say. So, example, if you look at the border districts of Karnataka, which border Maharashtra, right? People speak both Kannada and Marathi equally fluently. And my grandmother came from there, so I know my grandmother spoke 2 languages, Indian languages. My father, as I said, spoke Marathi and Gujarati. And I see that, it's possible. And in some parts of Mumbai, where, like especially where my cousins grew up, Dadar, Girgaon, the Gujarati family spoke Marathi, the Marathi family spoke Gujarati. So I feel that, it's not as much of a, issue that very often, like this linguistic wars, which people, talk about. Obviously, we've chosen a system of linguistic states. So administratively, one language will be important. But I think it's very possible to have just in any city, especially in cities which are melting pots, people speaking different languages.
So let's sort of shift attention to your mom, right? And I find your mom also very interesting. Like you said, not just a writer, but a feminist writer, someone who also taught, who, was a critic as well, who engaged with sort of all of that culture. And in times where such ideas would not have been floating in the air, like today, it's so easy to be feminist. You have world literature around you, you're reading, all the great feminist writers, and it's easy. But, to actually, in a sense, you're not inheriting frames. When your mother was born in 1933, I think. So, so she's not inheriting those frames of thinking too naturally. Or if she is, please tell me about it, because I'm not really familiar with, the traditions in Marathi literature of that sort of thing either. But she's figuring a lot of that stuff out for herself and writing about that. And your dad, I think, was 20 years older than her. He's 1913.
So it was a famous love marriage between a professor and a student.
Wow, okay.
Famous, infamous, controversial, whatever, but yeah, they lived a happy life. So my mother actually grew up in a very small town, so at least my father had the advantage of growing up in Mumbai. My mother grew up in Kolhapur, and which is at that point of time really a small town, but I think there were two things, one is Kolhapur at that point of time, at least what my mother tells me and what I've read, was socially a very progressive place. So Kolhapur for many years was ruled by this extraordinary king called Shahu Maharaj, so from, in some way a descendant from the Shivaji line. And Shahu Maharaj was someone who was way ahead of his times. So at that point of time, he tried to make, his administration more inclusive. He promoted education. I think some element of gender equality. Means another person I've written about him was Rajadhyaksha Gaikwad of Baroda. So I think my mother benefited from growing up in a pretty liberal city. And it's interesting that, looking back, my mother was part of a literary group, and many of them became, big names. I think if I remember right, there were 6 men and 6 boys and 2 girls, from that college. And in those years, I'd asked my mother that, you all used to go out for picnics. And she says there was, she says it's hard to believe, but there was no pushback that, what are these girls going out with these boys for, etc. The second thing, so the first thing, I think, just looking through it, that Kolhapur was an exceptional place to grow up. The second is, since again we have to shift back to the Marathi issue, is that within Maharashtra, by then, there was around about 50 to 70 years of feminist writing, right? So Savitribai Phule, obviously. There was this Tarabai Shinde, who wrote this very famous book called Stri Purush Tulana, where she asked whether, what is the difference between men and women? I think written in the 1890s. Yeah. So I was very happy when Ram Guha actually included her as one of the makers of modern India. Then you had, by then, there was a very famous book called Kalyanche Nishwas, I think published in 1933. It was written under a pen name Vibhavari Shirurkar, but then the author revealed her real name later. So there was already, in Maharashtra, a move towards gender equality, etc. So my mother was exposed to a lot of this, and then I think in college, and then when she comes to Mumbai, I think, the more contemporary Western feminism, which is Simone de Beauvoir and Germaine Greer and all, she started reading. But and this is what I mean, that within our own culture, there are these, deep sort of veins of, social reform. Even Gopal Ganesh Agarkar, I've mentioned this, right? There's this wonderful essay by Agarkar where he says that, this is written in the 1880s, mind you, Amit, where boys and girls should get the same education in the same school, in the same classroom. And he says somewhere in the early paragraphs that, I'll be asked by men that if the women learn and go out to work, then who will take care of the children, who will wash the clothes, who will cook for us? And Agarkar says, is there any divine law that only women have to do this work? In 1880s,
This is a Marathi essay.
it's a Marathi essay. I've actually shared it on Twitter a couple of times. So I think that there was, there was a progressive streak, at least I'm quite sure in other states, I'm not aware, but in Maharashtra. So I would assume that my mother, sort of drew again in her own way from both the domestic, the local tradition of gender equality and the international one.
My favorite story about Agarkar is that this is in the early days of Ferguson College, and he was teaching a biology class, and he asked the students that if donkeys had a god, what would that god look like? And then he put his hand behind his ears to indicate like a donkey. And, at one point, I think I got this from B.R. Nanda's biography of Gokhale, that he describes how Gokhale once tells this English lady that, I'm at Ferguson College, and she says, oh, that hotbed of atheism. And I actually studied there, and I had absolutely no idea of this history of the place and the Deccan Education Society in the late 1880s, 1890s. And my next question draws from that fact that I had no idea of this. Like, I think that one of the things that people often kind of talk about and lament is on the show is that there is this increasing sort of homogenization where a lot of these local cultures or local traditions are sort of being drowned out by the larger homogeneous mainstream noises that are coming from the cities. Like I did an episode a few months ago with Roshan Abbas and Vikram Sathe, and Sathe told me about how he'll meet these people in the film industry, and there'll be these Marathi kids who'll come from a small town, and they'll be talking Pula Deshpande, and they'll be, quoting from all their great Marathi writers and all. And a year later, he meets him in a party, and they're like dressed sickly, and they're saying, hey bro, what's up? And it's completely kind of gone. And I guess, what you said earlier about the hierarchy of languages, A, I couldn't agree with that more. But B, what has, in our post-colonial society somehow happened is that English has first had that flattening sound where it's kind of, become the aspirational language. And beyond that, as the administrative state from the center has become powerful, in a sense, Hindi has also had a flattening sound. And you could argue that even within a region, you go to a city, whatever is the language of that city will have a flattening sound when it comes to the dialects around it. And you could lose something. So I want to ask about, that is that narrative of loss true not just in terms of language, but also in terms of different strains of thought competing with each other. Like you've spoken about the sort of the Kolhapur more liberal kind of way of thinking, but that has coexisted also with other equally deep-rooted in Marathi culture strains which are much more conservative and whatever. And there also I get the sense that sometimes the conservativeness wins out because the conservative voice is always more shrill and, so on and so forth. And it's not always an easy journey towards liberalism, as it were. So what's your sense of it?
Yeah, that's true. I think it's inevitable that in any society there will be a diversity of opinion and views. I think in that sense, 19th century Pune, in the last decades of 19th century Pune encapsulate this entire tension, because it had very strong conservative voices like Chiplunkar, like Tilak, and it had the reformists, and then there were some people in the middle. And some of those debates became very personal, very acrimonious. So way before Twitter took over our lives and, poisoned it. But I think I wouldn't actually dismiss the conservative view also. So if you read Tilak, means it's remarkable, that man. So I refuse to again, say that, with the benefit of hindsight, that the conservatives are always wrong or the liberals are always right. I think what matters to me is the directionality, means are you taking society forward? I don't think you necessarily, I think, again, Agarkar, I think he writes in one of his essays about who is a Sudharak, who is a social reformer. And he says very clearly that, he says, I don't want to destroy what is there senselessly, I just want to ensure that what is not relevant to our times. So I think, at least the social reformers of that time, they had a respect for what existed. It's not that they were like blindly trying to pull down the entire edifice. Their argument was they're going to strengthen the edifice by, dealing with the cracks. And I think that is important. So I wouldn't, at any one point of time, this conservative versus liberalism argument, it gets heated. But in the longer thing of history, I think the conservative argument is important, Amit. Sometimes we talk about path dependency, whatever. But I think institutions or ways of thought which have emerged through long years of history have a certain value, means I don't see the reason to dismiss everything that is old as bad.
So, James K. Hardy once described the moderates of that time as extreme in moderation and the extremists as moderate in extremism. So they weren't that far apart. And, when my heroes are really, the reformers of that time, as it were, Gokhale, Agarkar and so on. And I think of them as people who were actually liberal in their ends but conservative in their means. Even they weren't, radical and in favor of kind of breaking everything down. And like you said, those debates are really important. But when you mentioned that essay by Agarkar, which is only, there in Marathi, and earlier you have spoken of how so many of the writings, whether it's Tilak or whether it's Savarkar, for example, and we can speak about him later, are only in Marathi, and you can't get a full sense of all of that from English. And that kind of makes me wonder about that. What do we learn from history if we lose history? Because none of that is really part of mainstream knowledge. Like, at one level, one imagines that why is humanity, so successful as a species? And it is because we are building on knowledge upon knowledge. The knowledge of the previous generation becomes part of the bedrock of this generation. In a different context, Larkin uses the line, it deepens like a coastal shelf, right? He uses it in the context of miseries. But I see knowledge also like that. Knowledge and a civilizational understanding should be deepening like a coastal shelf. But instead, what happens is that what I find in modern times, what I worry about is that simplistic narratives, start dominating the discourse, especially in these modern times where the discourse is so polarized with social media playing its part on that. And therefore, we reinvent the wheel, and sometimes we reinvent the wheel ineptly. And the fact is that these arguments, like Agarkar saying that no, girls should study in school and there's no reason, etc., etc., all of that is lost to us, and there's a certain kind of futility there. And and I've heard you comment on this in limited context, but overall, do you feel that there is just this massive, incredible loss, that all of these debates in Marathi, all of this writing in Marathi simply isn't there as part of the larger consciousness of the English educated elites, as it were?
To be frank, not just the English educated elites. I think even large parts of Maharashtra now has lost touch with this, and I think that's unfortunate. I think we need to know our history, right? Even if you want to transcend history, you should know the history first to transcend it. And I think that's what, in fact, Amit, just to pedal back a bit, when you said about what Vikram Sathe told you about people coming from small town Maharashtra and within a year talking this lingo and this hierarchy, it's not that people who, sort of judge others who speak in Indian languages and who speak in English speak very good English, means we know that, there is, some of it is just pure social arrogance. It's not that they have great mastery over English either. But I think that, these, how do you keep these debates alive? I think that's what is important, at least the knowledge about these people. And I think, if I may again just tangentially, something I've always tried to grapple with, that what makes the Marathi identity, and I've always thought about it in terms of three elements, and if you write it in English, it is semi-alliterative, which is, I think, the poets, Sant poets, of the Bhakti movement. Then there is Shivaji, and then there is the Sudharaks. And I think all these three have, the Sant poets gave a basic call for equality before God. I know there's an Ambedkarite critique that they questioned whether there should be anybody between them and God. They didn't actually question their role in society today. So they didn't question the caste system. They just said that, we can have a direct communion with God. But nevertheless, a certain sense of equality was rooted, because of them. I think Shivaji was an extraordinary figure, and his it's, a lot of is known about his military achievements and his military genius. I think his vision for the state was radically different from what we had till then, and the third is the Sudharaks, who basically, when Maharashtra was grappling with modernity for the first time, they helped the entire society sort of, go through that process. So I think, the Sudharaks play a very, very big role in the Marathi identity, the Marathi milieu, and therefore, I would think that, just like they made the argument that, what is there 100 years ago need not be relevant today. It's not that everything they said has to be taken as a set in stone. I mean, you can question them, you can abandon them, but I think their role is important.
You also face a Marathi identity, and the thought that strikes me is that what has sort of happened with the narrative that we grow up with is that these local identities almost are treated as a subset in the minds of people. So you're Indian, and then below that there is a subset, and that is Marathi and Marathi identity. Whereas if I look at, Marathi literature and culture, or if I look at Kannada literature and culture, as different guests have gone into, different local cultures, you realize that they're all incredibly huge, powerful nationalities of their own with really rich traditions. But the danger is that automatic thinking in terms of nation states, lines on maps, that it becomes like a subset, and then you just want to log on and listen to Taylor Swift to see what the fuss is about, and you lose whatever. You don't even give yourself a chance to discover the beauty in your own culture. Is there a sense that Marathi identity, as it were, could just be getting lost? Is it in danger, or you feel confident that it can continue to flourish?
There will be some level of homogenization in India. I'm a strong believer that, our best bet is the Indian nation state. So I completely dismiss ideas that each state can have its own existence, etc. I don't buy.
That's in a political sense.
Yeah, so I don't buy that. So I think some level, I think the spread of Hindi is inevitable. Means whether it should be forced on people or whether it will happen organically, we can debate it. But I think, Hindi is understood across the country, and I think some of it is. So then the question is of Marathi and, Kannada and Gujarati. And I really feel this is where our system of linguistic states actually promotes national integration rather than, means in the 50s, there was this fear that actually it would create a separate identity, and therefore, but I think actually it's been a great success, so within the broader Indian nation state, Indian national identity, if we can have some area of cultural autonomy, I think it works, and it's interesting that I remember many years ago, Balasaheb Thackeray had said this, he says that, remember that the salutation we use is Jai Hind, Jai Maharashtra. So we first say Jai Hind and then we say Jai Maharashtra. We are never for a moment are we saying that, so I think therefore some of this is an evolutionary process. Am I 100% confident that Marathi will be able to flourish for the next 100 years? Who knows, Amit, it's a lot, because if you see, gradually we have migration, we have the spread of English education, these things are happening organically. I don't think the state can whip people into a cultural, sort of box. I think you'll agree with me there. So some of these evolutionary things we'll have to, and this happens. I think there's this famous, I think maybe Mazzini or Garibaldi, that when Italy was finally united as a single country in 1860, I think just some 10% of people spoke Italian, and there were so many regional dialects, languages, and I think either Garibaldi or Mazzini has reportedly said, we have created Italy, now we have to create Italians, so so this is a process, I don't, but I think, which goes back to the point, if my guess is that Hindi will become more, will spread and it will become more widely spoken, and you want your local language also to prosper, and English will be there as something, then you have to think about a multilingual existence and a non-hierarchical multilingual existence, right? So as long as these languages coexist rather than any one of them suppressing the other, either through state action or through social pressure or whatever, it's fine.
So I'm just thinking aloud that, going back to Ram's lament about bilingual intellectuals sort of dying out or there not being so many, could one possible reason for that be that that mentally we give this hierarchy in our heads? Like most people who haven't had the kind of upbringing you had, mentally in their heads there'll be an hierarchy that, English will have one role and it'll be aspirational, and if they are in Delhi or whatever, then if they migrate to one of the big cities, they have to learn the language of that city,
Yeah.
and so on and so forth. And is that perhaps then a reason for the loss of bilingual intellectual? Because you can only be an intellectual in two languages if you're deeply steeped in it from childhood, I'm
Yeah.
guessing.
No, it's something I really wish I could, but I can't give a definitive answer. But I think the phrase you use, that English is the language of aspirations, I think this is something the Dalit community has also articulated, that let our children learn English. I think so. There are different ways of looking at this issue of bilingualism or multilingualism. So I think coexistence is it's an evolving situation. On the issue of I think it's about the judgmental thing, which I sort of am uncomfortable with. I think in your discussion with Rohit Lamba, Rohit says that somebody told him, why are you reading Tulsi Das? Are you like reactionary or something of that sort? I don't remember the exact. This is what is really irritating. Means why do you think that if you read a Tulsi Das or you read a Tukaram, or for that matter, if you sort of are active in the local Ganeshotsav Mandal of your city, why would that typecast you as progressive, backward, fascist, liberal? Means I think this just goes back to your point, right? That very often people jump to conclusions. Both means I don't think any part of the political divide is innocent of that crime. So I think we need to generally sort of be more in tune with what can broadly be called Indian tradition.
Yeah, and the superimposition of the political on the cultural is just incredibly toxic, because then you just close your mind off just so much, which is...
It's interesting. After your talk with Rohit, I had a small WhatsApp exchange with him. And this Tulsidas thing reminded me, it's a bit of a detour, Amit. So just bear with me.
Detours are encouraged.
Yes.
Please.
So Rahul Sankrityayan wrote this famous book, Volga Se Ganga Tak, right? And this is the sweeping history of humankind. And I tried to read it in Hindi. It didn't come naturally to me, so I bought the English translation. Interestingly, the first English translation was done by a Russian scholar, right? Because Sankrityayan, among other things, was also a member of the Communist Party. And this Russian scholar, this was in the 60s, he writes in his introduction that I was goaded to translate this by Comrade P.C. Joshi, who was that time a very big figure in the communist movement. And he says somewhere in that thing that P.C. Joshi had read Tulsidas 18 times. So now here is somebody on the left who has read Tulsidas 18 times. And then here is Rohit's, sort of comment that if you read, people, he has been asked that, if you're reading Tulsidas, aren't you like, so this I think is, this broad sweep that everything that comes, from a certain Indian tradition is necessarily backward and all. I just don't buy that.
I'll take a detour from the detour and ask about, since you mentioned, reading that book in the introduction and trying to read it in Hindi and then going to English, your deep interest in economic history has, of course, been remarked upon by many of your colleagues. And the little sense that I get from whatever of your writings I've read over the years is that you're just reading very deeply and you're reading very widely and so on and so forth. And my question, therefore, is that, what I notice around me sometimes is that there are a lot of people who, rather than sinking in, are reaching out. So you're going on social media and you're constantly swiping, skimming, reaching out to the wider world, and the engagement is often incredibly shallow. While what someone like you seems to be doing very often, and I don't know how much you read, how many hours a day, but feel free to talk about that as well. Someone like you is just sinking in, just reading a lot. There's no hurry to get anywhere, just, and actually the world is fascinating. History is incredible. It's mind blowing. There is so much more of it than the present time because there is so much more of it. So give me a sense of that. Like, was this always like a childhood habit with you that you'll just sit down and read and you won't have the anxieties of constantly keeping up with the latest books, the latest trends, the latest tweets, as it were, in the modern time? Or
Honest admission, I enjoy social media as long as you don't go down the, the usual noise. If you use Twitter, I have made great friends on Twitter. I get a lot of reading material. But yeah, I don't engage as much as I used to, say, 5 years ago. I see there are two things about my reading. One is I'm a pretty aimless reader, so it's not that I have decided that I'm going to read on whatever, like artificial intelligence. I'm buying 5 books on artificial intelligence and reading it. It's pretty much random, and it's pretty much erratic. The reason I am fascinated by economic history and history of economic thought, I think goes back to, again, some of our earlier things. I think a lot of, economics, there is a science and there is an art. In fact, the book which Dr. Kelkar and Ajay wrote, right? It's art and science of policy. And I think that what is this difference, that obviously there is a technical economics which is the ground, is the foundation, which I immensely respect. But when you think about how do you bring it to the real world, the same messy world, the second best world, which we spoke about, there are so many institutional complexities, there are cultural complexities, etc. So it can't, the same principles need to be used in different contexts, right? It's a bit like medicine. A doctor, every patient is different for a doctor. And for that, I find economic history very useful, and in fact, the history of economic thought, I'm fascinated by Indian economists. Again, I don't want to make a hierarchy that we have, that Indian economists, are better than Western. I have no such claim to make, but I think that economic history is important because in the real world, there is path dependence. So, just to quickly, something which came to my mind, an example, right? You ask yourself that why are the Germans the most hawkish on inflation? And their memories are still scalded by the great inflation, which led to the collapse of society and the rise of fascism. That's my theory, right? Or a lot of American economists of a particular generation, the Solow, Arrow, Samuelson, all these people, if you see the importance they gave to the problem of labor markets, and I think that comes from they grew up in the Great Depression. So I think a lot of what people write, say, research depends on the specific context and how do you take that into your own context. And I think economic history is important. So therefore, I feel extremely unhappy that economic history and the history of economic thought is not taught seriously in universities these days. I think it's important because, the art of economics is, and I've learned this from, people I've met, that how do you think about the application of economic theory or economic principles to our times, to our society.
And one aspect of my question also was about the personal rhythms of your life.
Okay.
Like in terms of...
So I'm an extremely unstructured reader, and you said that you read widely and deeply. I would, with no false modesty, correct you and say I don't read deeply. I read widely.
But good reading has to be unstructured because only then can serendipity happen.
I'm not a deep reader in the sense that do I really can claim total mastery over game theory, or can I claim total mastery about, say, whatever, monetary history? I can't, but I read widely, right? And as I said, it's pretty erratic. So currently I'm reading a book on East Asian economic policy, Mike Brearley's latest book on cricket, and I'm reading the Slow House series, the new book. So it's a very strange mix, So I just like the act of reading. I find it extremely relaxing. I don't think I've ever read because I want to get anything out of this or I want to be more informed. It's sometimes, sometimes you read things for the sheer beauty of the writing, sometimes because it's informative. The other thing is that, I've learned over the years is that I find myself going more and more to the classics, So I prefer sometimes rereading the classics to reading some book which has been promoted by the book industry right now, So you're hit by reviews and this and that, and I would rather spend going back and for 6 hours and reading something I really enjoyed. And sometimes, they say that, what is a great book? A great book is one which changes with you, right? So it's the same book, but every time you read it, it's as if the book has transformed because, you're getting a different view of things. So there are those books where I reread and reread. So
Tell me about some such book.
So forget the technical economics stuff, right? So one book which I enjoy immensely is Post-War, this book by Tony Judd on the history of Europe after 1945. So I think it's absolutely magnificent, the book. It starts off when Europe is at the nadir of its existence, right? It has 20 years of depression, civil war, and then, basically destruction of the war, and then how Europe rebuilt itself. And I think that's a book I keep rereading, There are some other books which I find myself going back to. Strangely, Gideon Haig's book on Vaughan, I think it tells you so much, not about just cricket, but about life, I think that's one book I have read. Maybe more names will come to me, but I think some of these books are Keynes, I think besides all his, again, the general theory, the treatise of money, Keynes's journalistic writings, I enjoy them thoroughly. I can just go back and read them every year, so.
I mean, many hours from now, we'll reach the end of the episode and I'll ask you for your recommendations. So no doubt you'll remember more by then. But let's go back to biography. So there's your childhood in the society. These are your parents. You're surrounded by Marathi books. You're surrounded by English books. What is it like to kind of grow up there? Like, what is the texture of your day out at that time? There is no internet. There are no smartphones. How are you spending your time?
So I think one thing we should make clear is that it was not some very bookish existence, right? Because both my parents loved cinema, they loved travel. So I don't think it meant that we had some very academic upbringing. And actually in school, I spent more time, I think, playing cricket than, studying. So I think during the examination, we used to have 2 volumes of the Wisden Cricketing Almanac, which used to be strategically hidden during my exams, So that's another book which you keep reading, although you know everything what's in it. But so it was not like intellectual in that sense that everything else was shut, means you ate good food and it was in many other ways a normal, but what I got the most is this group of friends, and I've spent 55 years of my life in that colony, right? And I'm close to 60. So almost my entire life I have lived there. And most of these friends came from very similar backgrounds. And you'll be surprised that even today, every Sunday for 3 hours, we meet in our colony garden over cutting chai and we talk about everything under the sun, and most of my friends today have done very well in their chosen profession. So we have doctors, engineers, lawyers, corporate executives, entrepreneurs. One of my friends is a photographer, another is like a leading Marathi theatre director. And, but we talk everything under the sun, and in such a big group of about 15, 20 childhood friends, they're bound to be different political persuasions, right? So there are some people, BJP, Congress, Shiv Sena, MNS, some of the old socialist, types, but we've never allowed political differences to ever come in the way. So I think that is something which I really value, that this rootedness in among my friends. And in fact, I joke, that everybody says that India is country of migrants, and Chinmay Tumbe has written this book, India Moving. It's a lovely book. And here I am, complete loser. I've stayed in one housing society for my entire life, and so were my friends. But I think again that has brought me. So it was it was otherwise a very normal, like we would play cricket, we would, we would have our local Ganpati festival, we would have our annual colony day where there would be the usual plays and music, etc. We would occasionally bunk, college and go for films, and it was nothing out of the ordinary. And I think that's good, because I would hate it if I grew up in this only academic or only bookish atmosphere. I think it was a much more relaxed upbringing, in school.
So, couple of questions. First, how was your conception of yourself evolving during this time? Like, what did you want to be? Like, did you at any point want to be a cricketer because you were playing cricket and all of that? Sachin, of course, is one of your young proteges, I have heard. So, what was it like? Like, obviously, I don't think when you're very young, you're like, I'm going to be a journalist or I'm going to be in policy. So, how did you see yourself? How did that evolve?
So, curiously, by the time I was in the 7th or 8th standard, I had decided I want to be an architect, See, everybody hopes to be a cricketer, but I realized very early on that I'm just not good enough, I wanted to be an architect, and I was pretty passionate about architecture. And so after my 10th standard, I joined college and I went into the science stream because my plan was after 12th, I will apply to architecture school and be an architect. And then, some of these accidents of life, I was standing in queue for admission at Elphinstone College. And then when my turn came, the professor said, okay, fine, for my marks, this, that, which, to be very frank, were not exactly something to, boast about. And she asked me that, okay, you're doing science, so what do you want to do after that? So I said, I want to be an architect. So trying to be an architect. So he said, okay, fine. So you're going to do physics, chemistry, mathematics. That's I said, yeah. So then she says, would you like to drop biology? And I was pretty good in maths and physics, but I was not very keen on biology ever. So I said, sure, it was amazing. So I said, but what do I take? So she said, no, from this year, we're offering economics as an option for biology. I had no clue what economics meant. So I asked a very stupid question. So I said, in economics, do you have labs, lab hours? So she said, no, there are no lab hours. So I quickly calculated that, wow, there's so much more time saved, from lab work. So I said, okay, fine, I'll do economics. That was my introduction to economics. It was just that accident. And so my idea was to be an architect, but I think somewhere in the my 11th standard, middle of the 12th standard, I figured out that I'm liking this subject, and then I made the switch. So yeah, journalism and all was not on the picture, but I sort of fell in love with economics.
Were there teachers that helped you do that? Because one of the big factors in happenstance in terms of, what goes on in college is if you have a good teacher in a particular subject, you'll start loving it. If you have a terrible teacher in a great subject, you might just be turned off completely. So what was that sort of process like? Because when I think back to college education, I think of all of it as being incredibly dull and dreary, and my sort of amateur fascination with economics came much later when I started realizing how it's basically a study of human behavior and human society, and that it was almost a freelance fascination, as it were. So in your case, how was?
So to be very frank, in the first 2 years where I sort of stumbled into economics, it was nothing, I don't think the classroom teaching was anything extraordinary. I think looking back, Amit, what perhaps sort of drew me to economics gradually was the fact that I was finding it useful to make sense of life around me. So when you move from school to college, you're suddenly, at least in Mumbai, exposed to a different life, right? You're walking to the station, you're seeing a different life, you're seeing the poverty, you're seeing, that time the famous Mumbai textile strike was on. So, that entire thing you could see. So I found economics helping me make sense of this. And at some point, I remember my father had, when he figured this out, he had asked me to read John Kenneth Galbraith's The Age of Uncertainty, which was a BBC program, but which was made into a book, just like Bronowski did Ascent of Man. This was the parallel economy. And if I remember correctly, he gave me Gunnar Myrdal's Asian Drama. It's a 3-volume work, but we had a abridged 1 volume, and I really found that fascinating. So teaching was okay. I sort of, my first attraction to economics was it's a good way to understand the world around me. There's some logical way to, sort of arrange your thoughts. I was lucky at undergraduate level to have an extraordinary teacher called Professor Malapur at Elphinstone College. And he really brought economics alive, and like some of our college friends, we still remember that he used to take the 9 o'clock lecture. So basically meant that you had to leave Bandra at 8 o'clock, which means that you had to drag yourself out of bed and, so not exactly the most attractive lecture to take in but he used to take the 9 o'clock lectures he would take on economics, and he would never take attendance. It's in those days, and you would not believe it, Amit, the lecture hall used to be packed. So that was the power of a good teacher. So I think he really, in that sense, fired my, and I was doing statistics along with economics. So I think I was happy that I did an empirical course with economics. But I think the really transformative teachers, Professor Malapur, fanned the flame, so to say. But the truly transformative teachers were in university. So I joined the what used to be called the Bombay School of Economics, and at that point of time, it was perhaps at the last stage of its golden age, and I had an absolutely wonderful time there. And the Bombay School of Economics, at that point of time, it was known as a center of dissent against the Nehruvian consensus. So the Brahmanand Vakil model, etc. And Professor Brahmanand actually was heading it for the first year of my MA. He retired in the second year. So that was one, so in a way. Second, it was a very eclectic sort of education. So we studied Keynes, Marx, Friedman, Joan Robinson, Shraffa, Kaleski, so it was we studied game theory. It was just the range of things we were exposed to was quite astonishing. And third, was a very collegial atmosphere. And I think, as I said, we had really good teachers, but 3 young teachers really made a mark on me, and I think I'm eternally grateful. If I became an economist and an economics writer, it is because of them, eventually. So there was Manohar Rao, Abhay Pethe and Ajit Karnik, and that time they were all in their 30s. And unfortunately, Professor Rao, at the peak of his power, he passed away a little early at the age of 51, but Ajit Karnik I'm still in touch with. He's now in Dubai teaching there. And Professor Pethe is like the closest I have to a guru in life, and I did my PhD under him as well. So I think they were in their 30s. They were fired up. I think we were a decent bunch of students. So they took, special care. And of course, cricket never leaves our lives. So we used to have, Saturday cricket matches. In fact, the first, again, detour. So first empirical project I took on was because of them. I sort of helping them. At that point of time, there was, there was some list of the most impactful cricketers or batsmen in the past 50 years. And it was not just based on average, it was based on some slightly more sophisticated empirics. And I think Sunil Gavaskar wasn't in the top 10. So that sort of got my professors worked up. So we actually, the first time I actually used statistics for a practical project was to prove that Sunil Gavaskar actually should be among the top 10.
And you managed to do that?
I think so. I don't know. I don't remember.
Yeah. I'm struck by what you mentioned about your college, about how you're studying Marx and Keynes and Friedman and Joan Robinson and all of these people. And I'm reminded of sort of Gandhi's famous quote of, I don't want my house to be walled in on all sides and my windows to be stuffed. I want the culture of all lands to be blown about my house as freely as possible, but I refuse to be blown off my feet by any stop quote. And, a beautiful sort of expression of that openness, which, in many places in most places in India, I think at that time it wasn't there. So tell me about how your frames of thinking about the world evolved. Like when we are young, we are often, in our attempt to make sense of a complicated world, we are often drawn to the first simple narrative which seems to explain everything. And then, of course, there is a danger we get dogmatic about that. But if we keep exploring, then, more and more winds blow through, as it were, and then you come to a different sort of understanding. And it is a journey that takes a lot of time. In my case, certainly 10, 15 years of just kind of figuring out what I think about the world to begin with. And thankfully, I didn't go through the university system to such an extent that I could be indoctrinated in any one way or fall prey to the fashion of the time. But what was that process like for you about just the frameworks of understanding the world?
Yeah, no, undoubtedly. I think I'll go back to the Alfred Marshall quote, right? You start off with more answers than questions, So I think in all this, like you're exposed to a whole range of schools of thought, a whole range of ways of doing economics, but you sort of latch on to something which makes sense to you at that point of time. And then you say, oh, I'm a Marxist, I'm a Keynesian, I'm a, XYZ. It's based on just heuristics more than anything else, or sometimes it's just that you want to be part of the coolest group in, in your college or in your university. So that happened. I think it's only very gradually that, as you said, sedimentation or whatever, I think I get the sense that understanding economic life is very complicated and it's complex, and therefore you have to keep an open mind. I don't think that labels are very useful after a certain point of time. Fine, there are there are identifiers maybe, but beyond a point, I think. And if you read like any of the great economists, you see even their views change, evolve, means, again, just to go back to Keynes, the Keynes who wrote the Treatise of Money in 3031 and the Keynes who wrote General Theory in 36 are very different, and you see it in Hayek, means Hayek sort of becomes more, at peace with like a social welfare state in the Constitution of Liberty. Then he moves back to, denationalization of money. So I think you see that even within, the greats, they evolve, they're trying to understand. So if the greats are doing this, what makes you think that you have the final answer? So it took a long time, Amit. I think there were many, I think first 10 years at least after getting my master's, I would say I was comfortably in the camp of easy answers. I know everything, and then gradually life teaches you hard lessons.
So tell me about the progression from there. Like when you did your MA, like what were you thinking? Was it just a natural thing that, oh, I've done my BA in economics and I love this subject and I'll do an MA and then I'll figure it out. Maybe I'll be an academic or blah, blah, blah. What was, because in those times, options were incredibly limited. The things were not as fluid as they are, that you flow from one thing to the other.
After BA, MA was like a conscious choice. I remember my professor taking me aside and in college, your undergraduate, and telling me, listen, why don't you apply to one of the IIMs, means your mathematics is quite good, you've got decent scores, give it a shot. And I said, no, I'm quite sure I want to do MA in economics. And as you say, at that time, it wasn't, opportunities were restricted, right? So there was academia. If you're sitting in Mumbai especially, you could apply to the RBI. There was organizations like CMI were just starting off. The Tatas had a economics department, and then there was economic journalism. And actually, if you look at it, today, like virtually every investment bank, every company has these battalions of economists. It wasn't there. In fact, I chose to go into academia, So I for 2 years, I actually taught economics at undergraduate level. But I had my moment of epiphany, I liked teaching, but I didn't see myself doing it. And I was always interested in both academia, both like economics and writing. So I said, I'll try my hand at economic journalism. There was a short period between academia and journalism where I actually worked in a small consulting firm. Not much to share about that. But yeah, so, and it's interesting that I have a very close friend, Anish Pradhan. You may have heard of him. He's a very famous tabla player. And like Anish is my closest friend from college, almost a brother. And he also, he had done his master's in history and, should I be a professional musician? Should I go teach history? So we were all struggling with that. So I tried my hand at teaching. It was fun, but I eventually decided to move into economic journalism. Yeah, so that actually then, perhaps we can talk about it. The exposure to economics in action also, sort of gave me, sort of a more nuanced insight into economics.
Let's dig into that in some detail after a quick commercial break. Hey, the music started and this sounds like a commercial, but it isn't. It's a plea from me to check out my latest labor of love, a YouTube show I am co-hosting with my good friend, the brilliant Ajay Shah. We've called it Everything is Everything. Every week, we'll speak for about an hour on things we care about, from the profound to the profane, from the exalted to the everyday. We range widely across subjects and we bring multiple frames with which we try to understand the world. Please join us on our journey and please support us by subscribing to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. The show is called Everything is Everything. Please do check it out. Welcome back to The Scene and the Unseen. I'm still chatting with Niranjan Rajadhyaksha, who's, hanging on here for many hours to come. Let's talk about like journalism and give me a sense of, which year was it? What was it like? Because today journalism is a completely different beast. But back in the day, I remember it was just a very small world, a world where not many people entered by choice. Like I used to joke in the 1980s when I was a teenager myself, little knowing that I would one day also be a journalist, that when people fail at everything else and they get into journalism, which is terribly cruel, but also there was something to it. So give me a sense of what that world was like.
So it was a very small world, and I joined a subset of that small subset called financial journalism, right? So there was really a very small group of people in that field, especially in Mumbai. So as I said, I moved hopefully out of choice, or you could say I couldn't do anything in economics, so I moved. But I joined a magazine called Business World, and I spent many years there, and it was a great learning experience because see, I actually between I jumped a few jobs, but like 1990 I joined Business World, and it was like opportune timing because this was just when the Indian economy was opening up, So I sort of, sometimes you're just lucky to be at the right place at the right time. And by 91, the reforms began, obviously in Delhi, but very often not adequately appreciated in Mumbai as well, right? The RBI opened up the banking sector, current account convertibility, the rupee became market determined, etc. So in a way, it was a great time to sort of be a financial journalist. It's, you got a ringside view of economics and action, and also the privilege to speak to the actors. And that, we can talk about it, was also a form of learning very different perhaps from the classroom learning I did at Elphinstone at the Bombay School of Economics. And I had good editors, but I think, T.N. Nayanan was my editor for some time, and he's obviously the most towering figure in the world of economic journalism. So I benefited immensely from Mr. Nayanan's guidance. I was at that point of time largely covering the financial sector, the Reserve Bank. So I was in charge of the finance section of the magazine. And that was a time when, business magazines had a very large readership, which, we were doing more in-depth stuff than the newspapers, perhaps a little behind the news cycle, but there was a fair bit of research involved, So I thoroughly enjoyed my time at Business World, and again, working with Mr. Nayanan. And generally, in Business World, there were lots of colleagues who, we had great fun and I learned from. And then after a long stint, I moved to Mint.
So a bunch of things to double click on for that period. And the first of them is this, that I remember that, when I and I kind of came on into journalism first as a freelancer and then with, Wisdom and Crick Info in the 2000s. But one thing I remember looking at the journalism around me, even as late as that period, is that in a sense, there was no the ecosystem didn't have that kind of bedrock of values built in, where you would get in and there would be a particular sort of way of doing things, and you would imbibe all these values from on high, and you would kind of, be shaped in that way. A lot of it was very ad hoc. If you were lucky to get a good mentor, if you were lucky to get a good editor that worked for you, otherwise you were just kind of fumbling around, doing a lot of writing, but you didn't, there would be no way to really judge it. And especially early 90s, there's no internet, so you aren't seeing the best journalism in the world. All you're seeing is what there is, and there's no, you haven't actually studied journalism in any way. And the best way to study it, of course, is on the job, but even there, you want to have good mentorship, good editors, and you were, of course, lucky to have Ninan. But so what was that period like where you are figuring out your values as a journalist? Because as a journalist, it is not just the mechanistic task that you get information and you construct a story out of it. It is also figuring out what kind of stories to do, what matters, what angles to take, what are your ethics as a journalist, etc., etc. So what was that formation like?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I think that was a time when many of these questions were not settled. There were maybe individual cases of this type or that type, but there were no broad, accepted rules of journalistic conduct. There were no, like simple thing like after press conferences, taking a gift from the company, means today it is absolutely impossible that to do it. But in those days it was common practice. I like to believe I didn't do it, but I didn't think, that it was wrong in that sense, Similarly, what constitutes a good story? How do you do sourcing for a story? A lot of it was like we learned as we went along. And as I said, I was very, very lucky to have Mr. Ninan, because I think in the 80s, India Today had already set up systems of, of professional journalism. And Mr. Ninan was at India Today through much of the 80s. So he had, in a way, brought some of that to our world. So there were still I would say, very good journalists, but I think the system of journalism was, especially financial. I can only speak about financial journalism. I have no experience of political journalism or sports journalism. But I think what Mr. Ninan did was to drive to us the fact that our stories have to be very well sourced. Our stories have to be written in a particular way, that you should think about data, a lot of these things. Just watching him, or sometimes informally when we spoke to him, we learned. So it was a learning curve for sure. It's not that when we went in, we were given something saying that this is how we practice journalism.
And where does, in every profession, I've sort of noted that 95% of the people, if not a greater percentage, are really just going through the grooves. They're ticking boxes, they kind of fall into a groove, and that's a whole thing. That's a whole game. And Bob Dylan has this famous line about he not busy being born is busy dying. And honestly, most people are busy dying. And there are a few people who, on the other hand, and I think because of selection bias, most of the people who come on the show are really actively engaged. They really care. They're really trying hard. I think the last journalist I had on the show was Malini Goel from, a similar period of time, a few years younger than you perhaps, but also did the business journalism and all of that. And what I noticed there is that what keeps them going is one of two things. Either it is a sense of purpose, however that is expressed, or it is just the love of doing what they are doing, the process itself. Ajay, memorably, we did an episode on Unix for our show Everything is Everything, and he spoke about this quality that he learned from his friend Ayush, that the quality of devotion, that you are devoted to it, that if you are doing a story, you are devoted to the process of doing that story. It can be a boring story, but you make those 5 phone calls and you don't cut any corners, and you craft the prose as well as you can, and you do it in time, and you do it with intensity, because that is just your dharma, that is who you are. So what was it like for you? Like, were there times where the work was really boring and it was just paint by numbers, or...
Amit, this may seem like an exaggeration, but I've never been bored with my work. I've always enjoyed it. So whether it is editing, whether it's writing, whether it is trying to think about how to graphically represent something. So I don't think boredom came into it. I've enjoyed my stint in journalism. about 95% of the people going through the motions. See, perhaps again I was lucky, but at Business World and then at Mint, I just had colleagues who were very, very good. And see, many of them actually chose to be in journalism. I had colleagues who were from IITs, from top business schools, colleagues who had other choices in life and who had chosen, and not everyone, but a significant number of people. So there was a sort of a culture of, if not excellence, at least doing your best, which I think was there at least in those years in the magazine I worked in. The thing is that, remember, in one sense, working as a journalist in those years was easier than today, and in one sense, it was more difficult. The easier part was access was not a problem, because there were such few journalists that you could actually pick up the phone and speak to anybody, you would at least reach that person's personal assistant, and then sometimes the CEO or the banker, or if you're lucky, the RBI governor, that was the level of ease of access. This is before the PR industry came in, spin masters took over, etc. So access for us at that stage of our career was far easier. What was more difficult was another type of access, which was access to data, access to, so if you were doing a story on a company, you actually had to get 5 years of balance sheets and do the numbers yourself, or if you're doing a story on inflation, you have to actually go to the RBI, get from their weekly statistical supplement, whatever, the money supply numbers, this, that. So in a way, what today you have, you can call up an analyst, or you can just go to the web and quickly pick up data. That was not possible. So, but that became an advantage in the sense that you actually learned how to look at numbers, I learned on the job how to understand monetary statistics, how, of course, economic education helped, economics education, but how to read a balance sheet. I think these were important. And that time, also, perhaps I was working a fortnightly, you could travel much more, so you could actually go to a factory, you could actually visit, distributors, or you could, so I think those times were in one way easier, one way more difficult.
And, when you mentioned, just being surrounded by other people who were deeply involved and none of the 95%, and I'm thinking that there's also a sort of clustering effect that happens there. Like earlier when we were having lunch, you spoke about how you liked Vision Asia Cricket, the magazine I was part of before we bought Cricinfo. And again, our editor, Sambit Bal, just put together an outstanding team, and I was just lucky to be one of those. And everybody was brilliant. And if I look back on those eras, the best writers of the decade in terms of cricket writing were all essentially in one place. And then you realize that, okay, you had that one happenstance of someone like Sambit, who was like a magnet for good writers. There were no other outlets and they all got drawn there. So is there something that happened perhaps with India Today in the 80s and later with Business World in the 90s, that it's a new field and you've got a brilliant editor, and then like a moth to a flame, they're all coming?
I would say, yeah. And at a third, I would say Mint later. I think we'll come to it. But again, now I will play your role, and to your listeners, it is my, reasoned view that Wisden Cricket Asia was the best written magazine in the past 20-30 years. And Amit, you were there, Rahul Bhattacharya, Chandrahas Chaudhary, Sidvi was there, I think.
Sidvi was there.
Samant, our friend Rahul Bhatia. I guess the names can just go on and on. So I used to actually buy that magazine it was not available easily. So I remember there was one guy in Dadar who used to stock the monthly magazine. I used to go and every month buy it from him. You will not believe it, Amit. Even today, I have some old issues of Wisden Cricket. It's that good a magazine. So I agree with you. I think that, of course, the editor and his vision is a magnet, but having good people around you. So, just to flip back into economics for some time, means if you look at, Michael Kremer, who won the Nobel with Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo for RCTs. Now,
His
before
O-ring
this,
theory.
The O-ring theory, right? The O-ring theory is that actually that people with the same skills are more productive in one company than in another. The reason is basically the complementarity. So just being in a team which has immense talent forces you or incentivizes you to raise your game, and I think that happened in BW and later in Mint as well, undoubtedly. So I think it's a combination of factors. One is that the 90s saw economic issues becoming more important. More people were keen to understand what was happening. Stock market mein kya ho raha hai? What is this? What are these reforms? Is that so readership was expanding. Second was information was more easily available for your own research. And third, I think in some of these places, just the quality of people. So I think it all played together to make it an enjoyable experience.
Tell me about how, moving from studying the economy in an academic sense to actually covering the economy in the real world. And as you said, in your case, the whole process was accelerated because you had insane access. I don't think a 24-year-old of today or, someone who's in his 20s today would have anywhere near that kind of access or near that kind of responsibility. Their publications may not even give them the big stories to do, but in a young place, you get to do things which, in other places, like I remember you spoke about Wisden Asia Cricket, that, one of the sort of what I would hear from veteran sports journalists on the beat were that, you are covering a test match. You are only 20 something years old. In my first 10 years in Times of India, I only once managed to get to cricket, and that was some, minor Ranji Trophy game, the 5th day of something. It took me 18 years to do my first test match, and here you are, young buck, you barely started shaving, you're doing a test match. But the advantage of being in a young new place is you just get to do everything. The responsibilities come. What was that learning process like where you're seeing the economy in action?
So, this point about having studied economics, how does it up? So I have generally tried to stay in touch with technical economics. I still continue to read economics papers. I try to read up on new empirical research, etc. But it's again, I was trained in the science. The art I learned on the job, at where do you apply what, and just this access to these, like policy makers who in a way transformed India was astonishing. So let me give you a few like examples, moments of epiphany or whatever you call it. So I remember once when I was at the RBI and the governor I won't name names as far as possible, the governor had called us in because it was just another of those weeks when, there was a run on the rupee. In those days, it was a little fragile, the balance of payments. And he had called us, about 10, 12 of us, to basically off the record, deep background, explain what the RBI's view is. So that his point was that when you're writing or when you're editing, just remember that this is what our, this thing is. So then this option, that option, and then the meeting got over and we were walking to the lift. And just by chance, I happened to be parallel to him, And so I asked the governor, I said, sir, you've said this, etc., that this guy, have you run out of options? So he smiled, and then he said, Niranjan, remember one thing. The sovereign is never out of options, and then he came in with a whole lot of, unusual, like, out of the textbook policy things to stabilize the rupee. So this sort of idea that the sovereign is not, or this time I'll name, in 2008, this was before the big crisis. So if you remember, in August 2007, the first jolts took place. The European money markets froze. Some money market funds went into trouble. Then things stabilized a bit. And then there were concerns through the summer of 2008. So 2000, it must be July. Dr. Reddy had called for a similar meeting, YB Reddy. And he said that, I want to just brief you. I've come back from the BIS meeting of central bankers. And at that time everyone was saying that, August 2007 is a distant memory, this will all be under control. And Dr. Reddy basically said that, if you remember, Anne Hathaway in The Dark Knight, that third movie, she says, "No, Mr. Wayne, there's a storm coming." So he in a way said that, and so he said, basically, we have to, RBI will have to protect the Indian economy, This is not something which comes from economic models or empirical model. It comes from a deep understanding of, how an economy operates. And I've been very lucky again to be, as I said, Professor Pethe is one guru, like Dr. Vijay Kelkar, who wrote this book with Ajay as well. I think I've learned so much from him about how to think about how to use policy, how to think about why would certain decisions be taken, not taken. So this art of economics, because that I think I learned on the job. And my guess is, you said access. I think knowing economics helped, or at least people thought that this guy follows what I'm saying, So I remember in, Dr. Rangarajan's time, I would ask him about monetary statistics. He was quite happy to meet me, Or I remember in April of 97, Dr. Jalan, or April of 98, I think, Dr. Jalan's first big monetary policy, RBI swung away from monetary targeting, and in this entire document, there were like one paragraph mentioning something about the stability of the demand for money. So I caught it, So I sort of, in the evening, I asked him, I said, so I have just one question. So he said, what? So I said, what does this paragraph mean? I said, does it mean that you're going to stop doing monetary targeting and you're moving to, a different... So he was he was happy that, so I think besides giving a framework, I think having some knowledge of theoretical economics also was a good signaling that, it's not a complete waste of time. Of course, it doesn't mean that you can only be a financial journalist if you're trained you have a business degree. I know so many of my friends who did very well without a formal training, but it helped. But yeah, so I think the big difference was, I was trained pretty well in the science of economics. I think I really learned about the art of economics as a journalist, largely through my interactions with these very, very distinguished policymakers.
Can we take a detour and can I ask you to double click on some of these mentors like Professor Pethe, like Dr. Kelkar and others who played an important part in sort of mentoring you, and tell me a little bit about like what were they like? What were the key things you learned from them?
So, yeah, I would basically Dr. Pethe, Dr. Kelkar and Dr. Reddy. So Dr. Pethe, as I said, we had very good teachers and we had, I was close through all those three young professors, and there was another one, Ritu Diwan also, who was very friendly with us. I think what I learned from Dr. Pethe is to think of economics as a system of thought. So he actually has not unique, but he has this rare ability to talk about the deep mathematics and the deep philosophy, almost in one adda, And his background actually is that he first did his master's in mathematics. So he's a trained mathematician, and then he did his second master's in economics. So he can actually speak on hardcore technical economics. Sometimes, very frankly, the mathematics is beyond my understanding. And then he can talk about the deeply philosophical issues of economics. So I think how to think about economics as a system of thought, of understanding. I think I learned a lot from him, and some of his lectures were just brilliant. He was not necessarily a teacher for the examinations. There are some teachers who will, if you quickly copy down everything on the board, that you're covered. I think he was not that. He was more they were open-ended lectures. Of course, he did stick to the syllabus. So you got a lot from him, and then, of course, in the canteen as well. Dr. Kelkar, I think I've been really lucky to know him since 99, and I think his understanding of Indian political economy and how to think about India's problems and his overall optimism about life in general. I'm amazed that even today if you go and meet him, he will have like 5 new like projects that why don't you help me with this, or why are you doing this? So he's extremely live wire, and he's a natural mentor. So there was a time when it's okay, I can name people, right? Like Urjit Patel, Arvind Subramaniam, Ajay Shah, so many people who basically said that, Dr. Kelkar has been one of their mentors. So I think his ability to connect with young people, but it's not just that, as I said, means we can go into it, but like there's sometimes when you have these aha moments with Dr. Kelkar, when you've read a economics, like a classic paper in economic theory, but you never know what it actually means, but suddenly he makes this passing remark, and Dr. Reddy, the same thing, and Dr. Reddy, because he moved, Dr. Kelkar was a lateral entry. Dr. Reddy started from the district level. So his deep understanding of Indian federalism, the political economy again, I learned a lot, means his he always you ask him a slightly more complicated question, he will say, have you read the constitution? Do you know what the constitutional, have you read the Constitutional Assembly debate? So he has a really deep understanding of what drives India. And of course, he's a very, very good policymaker. So these are some of the people, I think you're lucky to have such people, who are not explicitly saying beta bed either, I'm going to tell you something. It's just through multiple interactions, you learn hell of a lot from them.
So, taking off from your mentors, I also want to sort of ask about how during your trajectory through journalism, your roles also changed. Like initially you get into journalism, you're a reporter, you're doing the reporting bit, etc., etc. But you rose pretty fast within the ranks, within the editorial ranks, and you then also have to learn managerial skills. You also then have to figure out how to commission people, how to manage them. And at a later point in time, even mentorship, which is perhaps a separate question, but various people have described you as being just a tremendous mentor to them in different ways, in different places. So tell me a little bit about how all of that happened. How natural was that? Because by the time when I got to know you in 2007, you were already, I think, a managing editor at Mint by then, and you'd, been in that sort of position for many years. But how was it? How did you sort of, like, in a sense, the way you learned values as a journalistic writer on the job and through looking at, through learning from whatever editors and mentors you have, in a similar sense, you would have had to learn the managerial aspect of it, the editorial aspect all over again. So tell me about that journey.
Yeah, so I was lucky that I progressed through the ranks pretty quickly, and as much as I would like to believe it was because of my individual brilliance or whatever, I don't think that's the story, because I think what happened is that in the late 90s, there was an explosion of financial media. So new magazines came in, new newspapers, television channels had appeared, Reuters, Bloomberg, they had expanded. So, and a lot of journalists of my age also went abroad, to Far Eastern Economic Review and etc. So I think just basically what happened, there's so many new jobs and fewer people. So I think that helped a lot. So, as tempted as one may to think that it's a reflection of your qualities, actually it was just, again, being at the right place at the right time. So I had just had enough of that experience. So I would say by 30, I was already running a large team. It was never tough in the sense that I never had people pushing back in that sense, but you have to learn again on the job. I've never learned business management or anything. And I think I decided to sort of be true to my temperament, So I think I'm not temperamentally a micromanager. So like I prefer to be more like a curator or whatever. So I think that if I look back, and again, I've not thought through this very clearly, but what I have done or tried to do is, one, hire very smart people, So I think I spend a lot of time in the hiring process, because half the battle is won if you get very smart people to work with you. The second, I think, is as a manager, you have to give clarity to the people who you employ or you hire about what you expect from them. It's very often there is a lot of very loose talk about what your role. I think there clarity about what has to, and then once you do that, I think it makes sense, at least given my temperament, to let people be free. At least, especially in journalism. I don't know. I'm not sure it's the same on the shop floor. Perhaps even make their own mistakes, as long as they're not catastrophic mistakes which land you and your organization in trouble. So I think these are the three founding ideas or principles which I have tried to do as a manager. I don't really like to micromanage people, and as long as they know what is expected and they're smart, I think most people do turn out to be good. So I think that's been my style. It's not that I knew about it from day one. That's how I sort of grew into it.
And that's very interesting to me because, earlier we spoke about Sambit Bal and how he ran Wisden and then Trick and Four. And one of the things when I look back on him now is not just that he had this bunch of really fine writers working under him, but that he gave them all complete space. Like, I look back at some of my writing then, I'm in my 20s, man. I'm just playing all my shots. I'm totally flamboyant. It's cringeworthy, some of it, right? And yet he wouldn't say much. He would just let me learn from my mistakes. Maybe he had the maturity to realize that these people have to go through these phases, they will come out of it, etc., etc. And I found that to be a very enlightened attitude. Equally, I remember when you curated the Mint section, column section, when it began, and you asked me to do a column. And I remember at that time that one, your lineup was refreshing because your lineup was of people who mostly were otherwise not writing anywhere else. You just curated a bunch of new voices, and suddenly these people are writing. And in the time that I wrote that weekly column for you, I don't remember you once micromanaging, or you once, cutting something down or telling me don't write about this, or why don't I just felt intensely free. Whatever value you added would have been in subtle ways in the background without me even realizing that, that. So tell me a bit about how you arrive at that, because to be honest, I mean, I've evolved to the same style in the editing gigs that I've done, but it's taken time. Like you, I was, I became managing editor at Click-Info really fast, but that was just because it was a young place and it was just a few of us, and I was perhaps the least likely to mess it up. So it was that kind of thing. But initially, I remember that there is that learning phase where initially you want everything to be kick-ass, you want to micromanage everything, you want to look at every paragraph in decision and all of that, and later on you learn to just sit back and chill out. So
I think even I must have learned on the way, because there is the first tendency of an editor is to rewrite, just start. And I've given that up many years ago. And there is this book by Ved Mehta which is on William Shawn, who was the legendary editor of the New Yorker, and the subtitle is beautiful. It's The Invisible Art of Editing. So basically, how do you keep the writer's tone and his thoughts intact and then just add value? And I've seen the best editors do it. So I think, if I may again detour, Amit Verma.
Please.
So jumping to my mother's story, so one of my mother's legendary or most celebrated short stories was called Videhi, which actually is considered to be one of the greatest short stories in sort of, Marathi, modern Marathi short story writing. And my mother tells me that she wrote the first story. She took it to her editor at a very famous literary magazine called Satyakatha. He read it. He said, it's a good story, but it's not working. You have to, he says, just give it another shot. My mother gave it 2 more rewrites. He said, see, I think that within this, there is something very good, but I don't think you're doing justice to your idea. So he said, can I tell you a piece of advice? So my mother said, what? He says, tear this story up for 6 months, let it rest in your head. And then after 6 months or 8 months or whatever, come back and write it. And my mother, almost dramatically in his office, tore up her story. She walked out. After 6 months with that same kernel of an idea, she sat down and she wrote a completely different story based on that theme. So again, the editor's name was Ram Patwardhan. I think this is, I don't think I can ever aspire to that level of editorial excellence, but I think editing has to be invisible. You have to keep the voice of the writer, the thoughts of the writer intact. Obviously, if you see, you see sometimes contradictions, you see too much flamboyance or, overuse of adjectives, adverbs. Amit, we know all the standard rules, and like you yourself are a great coach or trainer of, so many writing schools, etc. So I think that was my thing. First is, as I said, these three principles, like hire smart people, tell them clearly what you expect, and then give them the freedom, including the freedom to make mistakes. Editing should be light touch, means there'll always be some time when there are disasters and you need to do more, but generally editing should be light touch.
The American version of Ram Patwardhan would probably be Gordon Lish. So Raymond Carver, legendary short story writer, and he used to publish his short stories in Esquire, and they were edited by a guy called Gordon Lish. And it was only after Lish stopped editing him and Carver's stories came out as they were written that people realized the difference Lish had made to his writing. And basically, the famous stripped down Hemingway-ish style of Carver really came from Lish's editing, which kind of gives you a sense of, and in a sense, when you are, say, curating a column section like you did at Mint, or when you are hiring people for a team, regardless of which publication or which place that is, in a sense, you're setting the whole character of that section, of that publication and all of that. So how conscious a sort of a decision is that, that?
See, I think it's very conscious. So let's stick to Mint for now, See, first of all, I think Mint, its success grew out of this extraordinary partnership between Raju Narisetti and Sukumar Ranganathan. So I again say it very bluntly that I think the success, a large, like just huge part of it goes to these two guys, means their vision and the way they set the systems up, the direction they gave the paper. When I was given the charge of the opinion section, I think first thing which Raju did was he said it would be like the American system where it's independent of the news operation. So you're not reporting to me on a day-to-day basis, you're running your own thing. Of course, I consulted Raju, I consulted Sukumar so many times, but I was given extreme freedom, The second thing, Amit, so Raju and Sukumar, they were very clear that Mint would be not another pink paper, So first of all, the primary, way to distinguish yourself is size, right? So we've started with this Berliner format. And, the idea was that it would, news is now ubiquitous. It's all around you, right? Wherever you go on your phone, on your television screen, you get the news of the day. So how do you adapt? So it was a post-internet, more analytical paper, more, like more features. At one point of time, we even thought of calling it your daily magazine, it was that. So Raju would always say, try to do day two story on day one. So the day one story is this has happened, day two stories, why has this happened, what does it mean? He was saying, always try to do the day two story. So we like strategizing about the editorial page. I think one thing I was very clear about is that we need new voices, because a lot of the editorial and op-ed pages at that time were dominated by people within a certain ecosystem, And I said that, this is cannot do. So I sort of started figuring out new writers. That time blogging was taking off, if you remember. So many good bloggers I approached, including our friend Nitin Pai, if you remember. And the second thing is, you have to also take some risks. If you if you just do the same thing, RBI has done this, it has to be more interesting, engaging. So editorial pages should be as engaging as the news pages. That was my idea. And I think what I can say I'm reasonably proud about is that Mint gave a platform to many new writers, means I'm just sort of like Sajid Chinoy wrote his first time in newspapers with us. Nitin Pai, Gulzar Natarajan, Amol Agarwal, Shruti Rajagopalan, then on the commentaries, on the column side, I invited you to write. Anant Nageshwaran that time had written a few pieces here and there, but as a columnist, we took him on. Salil Tripathi made a comeback into Indian journalism with his column. So I think that, these were like younger writers with more flair and also, fresh views on things. So I think there was a bit of risk taking, which I think Raju and Sukumar backed me on. Yeah, so I think in that sense, you have to cast the net wide, means you shouldn't have this thing that, oh, this guy's a blogger, so he's not fit to write for my thing. Or, it could be anyone, right? So very often I got like sometimes people just send blank, mails without any, whatever you call them. And you read and you say, wow, this is something good, so you take it. And I think that's how we built this roster of new journalists. I like just example of our friend Shruti, right? She was 23.
I introduced her to you,
Yes.
so I will take credit for
at
this.
Crosswords over coffee, I remember. Rajiv Mantri and Harsh Gupta. I think again Rajiv and Harsh must have been in early 20s, precocious talent. And I got them to write for Mint. So again, it's not about this ideological persuasion or that. I just got a whole bunch of people. So yeah, that I think that is something I can say I'm reasonably proud of.
You spoke about day two news on day one. And, this reminds me of a fundamental way in which cricket journalism changed in the 90s, where earlier the job of the cricket journalist was say what happened. There was a day's play, your reader is picking up the newspaper, she has no idea what happened, tell her what happened. That obviously changed when information became a commodity. You had Cricinfo, you had television, you had live broadcasts, you had everything. You already know everything that happened to whatever detail you wish to find out in, and therefore, and I think the British broadsheets probably pioneered this in terms of cricket writing. So the Guardian, the Telegraph, the Times, where it wasn't a mere match report. It had color, it had perspective. Often the writer would have the liberty to focus on one big theme for the day and go through that. And it was really a day two piece, to use a parlance which you just introduced me to. Through your time as a financial journalist, then, how was it changed? Like, how did this change? Because you have all the TV channels then coming on, your CNBCs of the world and NDTV Profit and all those guys kind of come on. All the information stuff is kind of already a commodity. So how does the shift happen? Because, for example, I guess the journey that you make, and I'm just thinking aloud here, but the journey that you would make as a financial beat reporter is first you do just the reporting, you get the quotes, you put the stories together, etc., and then you move on to higher order stuff. But in a sense, here in this new world of post-internet, this thing where you're doing the day-to news first, you have to get into the higher order stuff almost immediately. So what was this world like? What was this change like?
So I think it was a very, very major shift. And, since you mentioned reporters, because obviously I have immense respect for beat reporters because they face a very, very difficult task because deadlines can be immensely tight. Means something happens at 5 o'clock and by 8 o'clock you have to file a story. Then you have to make the story stand out from the competition. And for a general life, daily life of a beat reporter, the noise to signal ratio is very high, especially in the financial sector, right? The financial markets is buzzing with all sorts of rumors, this, that. So I think that it's very difficult to be a beat reporter. And again, just to reiterate, I'm talking purely about the financial. So I have great respect for how a lot of beat reporters have tried to bring more analytical insight into their writing, not just in Mint, but in many other. I think some of it is really high quality. But, Amit, I think just on a meta point to what you said, that the rise of the internet, television channels, now information is available all around, So at one point of time, people who had a funnel for information had a comparative advantage, your ability to collect information. Now, people who have filters are better off because that funnel job is now not important. It's all around you. So then the filters, and I think this is again where editorial judgment matters, what to play up, what to not play up, because I think these filters, besides the discipline of having a second eye look at your story or, bolster it or whatever. I think this filtering process, which a good editor can do, both on the opinion side and on the news reporting side, is of value. And I think it's of more value now because you just can't carpet bombing readers with information is not very useful because anyway information is all around you.
Tell me a bit about Mint, because Mint was a pretty dramatic shift at the time, when it came. And you spoke about, the remarkable teamwork of Raju and Sukumar and what they respectively brought to the party. So tell me a little bit about that, because it seems that, in that business of a whole bunch of media houses and everything is same old, and everyone's trying to build a slightly better mousetrap, along comes Mint and says, no, we are something completely different.
So I remember in my so I've stolen one line from Raju, but in my previous answer, but first time I met Raju in a small restaurant in Mahim, one thing he told me is that we don't want to create another pink paper. Means he says they're good, but they already own that space. Another of that is, so we're going to basically try to shift the game, and I think that was really, and this is interesting that, like, if I may again bring in old economist Schumpeter, in his book Capitalism, Socialism and Democracy, he says that the real source of competition in a market is not on price. We always think price cutting and all, but he says it's the new technology, the new way of doing things, the new idea. That is what actually makes the biggest shift, means eventually Nokia lost out to Apple or Samsung, not because of their pricing, but because they just changed the game with, smartphones. So I think similarly, Raju's idea and I think Sukumar's idea is that, we'll create something new. But I think it's not only that. I think Mint had, for the first time, so we spoke last time when you were talking about business world, about whether, were there the systems. I think what Raju really brought in was internal systems, so how a story should be written, what was the struggle, what are the essential requirements of a story, how should it be sourced, how much time do you give a company to get back to you, do you need an outside voice, how much data do you need in a story. Secondly, there was actually a code of conduct, and a code of conduct not in just the way of, don't take money from your sources, but a more nuanced code of conduct. For example, that a Mint journalist will not misrepresent himself, that you will not do this. So it was a very clear code of conduct. And I think also what they brought in were international standards. Raju had come as editor he was managing editor of Wall Street Journal Europe, and Sukumar at that time was managing editor of Business Today, which was another excellent thing. So I think they brought in, besides the vision, they brought in these systems which made a big difference. And then, just on a day-to-day basis, asking simple questions, that, so suppose inflation has been announced, inflation number, and somebody would say, pitch it for page 1, and Raju would say, why? By the next morning, everybody who cares would know this number. So tell me something more, So he would push. Sukumar would push. I think that helped. And besides that, just like I said on the opinion side, there was risk taking. Just the type of stories we played on the page 1, or, sometimes full, we did a series on the economics of religion, and, there were some ground stories, and Saman Subramaniam was there, Pallavi Singh was there. So really Priyanka was there. So really good feature writers had a very prominent role. So I think it was vision, it was this system they set up, and then the day-to-day, raising of standards. And I must say in the early days, it was tough for some people, but I think eventually everybody lined up behind the vision.
Tell me a little bit more about these systems in place. For example, earlier you said that Raju, when he came from WHA, brought certain standards in terms of this is how much time you give a company to respond, and this is where you need data and you don't, and etc., etc. And you're kind of setting a template in place. And at one level, you might say that, hey, there's an art to journalism as well. But at another point, I completely buy this, that once you have those templates in place, that gives you the solid framework that nothing's going to go wrong and you're guaranteed a certain minimum kind of quality or integrity or whatever it is.
So, even Bloomberg has this, this famous 3-para intro, and I think basically, for example, I'm just like now thinking off the top of my head, but no story should preferably be on record. If they are not on record, there should be at least two independent confirmations from two separate sources. It can't be from the same investment bank, the same company. If somebody does not come on record, you have to explain to the reader without revealing that person's identity why that person, he's not authorized to speak to the press or whatever, there should also be always be a nut graph, what the Americans call, which is, explain early on why this story matters to the reader. So just putting this reader up front, don't write for your sources, write for the general reader. I think some of these things, always have an independent voice. So if you're doing a M&A story, you will obviously speak to the company, you'll speak to the investment banker, you'll speak to the lawyer who's done the deal, but try to get a business school professor who can say that, does this, what will happen in terms of the competition law or something, so try to get an independent voice, if not two. So I think just simple, these, reporting rules which Raju and Suku put in were quite remarkable. I think Mint did make an impact. I think other papers started gradually picking up on that, at least on the financial journalism side.
And how was journalism changing in those times? Because Mint started 2007, and
yeah, so 2006 we joined. 2007 was
when you started, and a lot changed in the years after that. During this period of time, what also happened is that political pressures increased, that partisanship became more common, and of course simultaneously the discourse became much more polarized on social media and so on, and you began to see a lot more stories which would break, like for example that rule about always being on the record. But if you look at a lot of the long form stories by someone like Caravan, for example, where you'll speak to a whole bunch of people off the record because you are determined to do a hit job on a person and wipe them out completely, and it's a pretense to rigor, but there is really no rigor out there. So it just felt that there was a sea change within journalism itself, and a lot of people within kind of lost faith, and from the outside lost trust, because you and I grew up in a time where there was a consensus on the truth. You got it from mainstream media. There might be 19-20 ka farak, that okay, Wall Street Journal slightly right, New York Times slightly left, but basically they agree on 99% of things. And today we live in a world of narrative battles where none of that is there, and that changes the pressures on the journalist completely. So in this kind of environment, so what's your sense of what has happened over the last 15 years?
Well, the atmosphere has changed, not just in India, but I think the divide has become more obvious. But I think if you remain true to honest journalism, and as you say, not everyone does, and your stories are well reported. See, my own view or my own experience is that you have to build up credibility with readers, like story by story by story. I don't think, there are no quick gains in this, So, but if you build your reputation as a credible newspaper, I still feel readers respect you, and in most cases, Amit, despite this, the sort of sharpening of the divide, etc., I have realized that as long as people don't sort of question your motives, or you don't give them reason to question your motives by being blindly partisan, I think even people take criticism on board. I think it's important to, like, again, to go into the editorial pages, you keep a mix of people as long as they don't cross certain red lines about, say, bigotry or something of that. I think it's fine, means, no, so it's become more difficult for sure. And of course, I've been away for now close to 7 years. So I don't know. I don't have a direct experience of the situation, but I think a lot is said about the pressure from outside on the media, right? From corporate advertisers, from governments, from this and that. But I think there's an internal question also, and which is again why, the editor matters, the internal processes matter.
So I used to sort of I've written columns for every Indian publication basically by now, but I used to write for one of the major dailies and every Sunday. And one their whole game was exactly what you said, that have a viewpoint diversity, have people from left, right, whatever, right columns for us, and it was great. So during demonetization, for example, the harshest critique of demon came from me on those pages, and that got shared widely by the Congress and AAP and everything. And they were carrying it, even though in the public imagination they were viewed to be for this dispensation. But then that gradually changed. Like what happened circa 2020 was, I had written a very harsh piece about the government, and my editor called me practically in tears, and she said that, listen, I know you don't like me to cut anything. They would always send me a playback if they wanted to cut something, and I know you're very particular, but there's just this one line or two line or whatever, I forget how much it was, that I absolutely have to cut because there's pressure from above. And it's they've complained specifically about you and Akar Patel, who was also then a columnist there and no longer, I mean, he told me later he was fired by them. And I thought about it, and the piece was overall very critical. The bit that she wanted to cut didn't really make a difference. So I said, fine, cut it. It's not a big deal. And then I thought long and hard that should I just walk away on principle? And I thought, look, if I walk away on principle, that space will go to somebody else who might be more pliant. So why don't I keep trying to make a difference? Now, eventually I stopped writing because I just came to the decision after a couple of more columns with them. I just came to the decision that I just want to write for myself. I don't want to write for any other platform ever again, because luckily by now I have a large enough following that it makes sense for me to do my thing, whether on the newsletter or the podcast or whatever. So I just feel that, like, I'm not leading to a question here, but I just feel that the atmosphere has come there, and my sense is a lot of it has to do with sort of structural incentives, that all the big mainstream publications are attached to business houses that might run other businesses if you have a newspaper. But if you also have a chemical factory and the ED can raid that and the income tax can raid that, then your incentives change drastically, which is why some of the people fighting the good fight today are the smaller players like Scroll and News Laundry and News Minute and so on and so forth. But moving on from that, another aspect of journalism that I want to talk about is also the changing environment within newsrooms. Like, one of the pieces of praise that I've heard about you is that long before Me Too happened, you had laid down strict guardrails at Mint and against harassment, and very clear policies on that. You had told everyone that if there's any problem, you come straight to me, and you guys took a sort of a no tolerance line on that. So it just wasn't about sort of journalistic standards in terms of what you do with your pieces or how you report your pieces, but also within the workplace itself. And I find that really interesting, because a problem that India has had, and I think it's much more in advertising and corporates and perhaps in newsrooms, but I'm sure it was there in newsrooms to a large extent, is of toxic environments, so very sexist environments and just stereotypes being perpetuated. I remember the late Sujata Anandan was once on this show, and she told me in her time she was lucky to be given the political beat when she started in the 80s. But otherwise, the default was that if girls are there, they do the soft stories, they do the features, etc., etc. And coming from the kind of background that you do, where your mom was such, in a sense, a pathbreaker and a warrior herself, I'm not surprised. But give me a sense of how the newsroom evolved over this period.
Yeah, so first of all, it was not just me, right? I mean, I think Raju and Suku, as I said, they set up the broad framework. And I think, the Vishakha guidelines of the Supreme Court had been, of course, now it's compulsory to have a posh committee, etc., but I think at that point of time, the Vishakha guidelines were broad guidelines. And the idea, of course, was that, the workplace should be a safe workplace. But how do you operationalize it? Because what happens is, very often, especially younger girls who come into a workplace, they're not very sure, whether what has been said or done, is it harassment? Is it just, because you have no previous experience, right? So I think the idea of telling, these young girls that you come directly to me, because the chances of an HR guy taking it up were a little, slim. So I think that, but I think generally the Mint newsroom, I think, was, I don't know whether there may be examples I don't know of, but I think it was generally a safe space for general people, irrespective of their gender, their sexual orientation, their religion, caste, etc.
So, after all these years where you pretty much, in a career sense, people would say you're pretty much at the pinnacle. You decided to sort of leave journalism and come into a world which, in a sense, you already knew. You had one foot into, which is the world of economic policy and which is the world of the political economy and so on and so forth. So, tell me a bit about, what was your mindset through these years? Like, how are you looking at your life in terms of the story of your life, the trajectory of your life? That, what prompted the shift where others would say that, hey, you are at the top, you're an editor, you're doing, you've got everything now, just chill and, 15 saal karo. But you chose to sort of.
Yeah, so bit of restlessness. There was no push factor, right? Means Sukumar and I had this absolutely wonderful working relationship. I still value him as a very good friend. I learned a lot from him. So there was no push factor, although by then Sukumar had moved on to Hindustan Times. I was, sort of thinking that, something kuch aur karna chahiye. So actually, Amit, if you look back, I have, although I didn't change jobs too often, I changed my job profile within companies very often, So even in Mint, I did the opinion section. Then I was the managing editor. So I ran I was in the news operation. Then for some time, I did the features section. Then I helped Pramit and all launch the data journalism section. So I tried to always, sort of seek new challenges. So I had come to it was just internal restlessness. It was nothing else. There was no, that I should do something else, and in the meantime, I had finished my PhD, etc. So I said, now what, and then, so I said, one thought always has been academia, to go back to where I started from, because I love teaching. At the Meghnad Desai Academy, I do teach on and off. I've taught here and there in some other institutions as well. But I thought that this area of policy research was something I would be interested in and enjoy, and then of course IDFC Institute was in Mumbai. It happened to be led by Ruben, who's a very close friend of both of us, and both of us have, a lot of respect for him. So that's how it happened, So it was a build up of this thing, that restlessness, that I should do something else now.
And is there somewhere in this journey a sense of purpose built in, or is it simply not so much a purpose at doing something specific, but more of the purpose of following your curiosity and doing what excites you?
I think the latter, I don't think I've thought of my career in that structured manner. And I just sort of taken decisions which at that point of time I find interesting, So I just thought that if I do something like this, it'll be a new experience for me. It'll be a fresh start. So that was it. There was no purpose of this will build to that and that will build to that.
And in a sense, what you're doing, and I'm thinking aloud again here, is that like IDFC and IDFC was and Artha is today a think do tank, as Ruben calls it. That you do a lot of thinking, but then you try to work together with government and actually implement it on the ground. And these seem to be polar opposites, in the sense that thinking is about, in a sense, it comes from a pure place. You apply first principles, you figure out what to do, and then of course you take into account the messiness of the world and you try to come up with practical solutions. And the doing is really once you get into the political economy, there's nothing pure. You just try to figure out what is the best that I can do, if not the second best, the third best, the fourth best, whatever. And as a journalist, you could have a ringside view of the world of ideas and the world of action, and look at them completely differently. What was it like to be thrown into this, like in terms of the thinking, in terms of the research that you wanted to do? What attracted you? And in terms of the doing, how was it to be thrown into the doing end of things? What was that like?
So it was, because I obviously, as a journalist, as an editor, I had access to policymakers, but it was always at the slightly rarefied realms. I think that just practical questions which policymakers face, and I think it's been a learning for me over the years. Amit, you grow up with this classic middle class thing. Entire government is corrupt, politicians are useless, But I've actually, in my later years as a journalist, I've come to also appreciate what politicians, or the good politicians, the good bureaucrats, even the good, junior people running maybe a police station or taluka office, how much they work and how much they bring to the table. So first of all, there was this thing that it's not a complete lost cause, that nothing can happen. I think that there are reform champions, there are, people who are ready to take the risks. I thought that also some of the more micro issues which I had not applied my mind to, those were often, came to us as, research projects, etc. I mean, this is like really brass tacks plumbing work, and I think this also I realized is of immense importance, means you can have the greatest broad framework, but, as Vajpayee ji had once famously said, magar ye hoga kaise, I think that magar ye hoga kaise issue is very important.
Give me an example of the broad framework and the plumbing.
So, one of the projects we did was with the government of Bihar, and M.R. Sharan and Chinmay Kumar were actually doing the work. They were in Patna, but I was technically the lead investigator for that project. Of course, most of the work was done by Sharan and Chinmay. So, the Bihar government had passed a grievance redressal law, which basically meant that all citizens can, for their salaries, public services, whatever the government is supposed to deliver to them, if the government fails to deliver, A, the citizen can complain, and B, there is a system where that grievance is redressed through a system of, hearings, etc. Now, this was amazing empowerment, right? And Nitish Kumar was the chief minister. And I think what the chief minister's office found out, that despite this, there was, just a very poor uptake of this. So the question was why? And when Chinmay and Sharan actually went down, they saw that there were lots of interesting, reasons. Sometimes as simple as the poorest people living on daily wages just can't go for a day to a government office, So then can the government office come to them? Or, people don't know. So suppose you record a message in the chief minister's voice and, play it. Will that, so there are a lot of the RCT type of work. One of the things they found interesting is that although citizens were not using it, the ward members, which is, in the panchayat, there are these ward members were using this system to represent the grievances of their constituent. So some of these things are not evident from a bird's eye view, Many years later in Punjab, we had this thing about vaccination, why vaccination during the COVID thing was not taking off. And we did a survey and we found that people think a vaccine it's not a preventive, but it's a palliative or whatever, it's after you sort of. So people thought after you get COVID, you should take a vaccine. They didn't think it's a preventive vaccine. And when we found this in the survey, we took it to the government and the government said, we should redesign the communication on the vaccine. So these are the micro issues, which sometimes policymakers face. So I think some of these insights are very, very important. So this is the sort of plumbing issues I spoke about.
Give me a theory of change. Like, how does change happen in the government? Like, at one level, if you just apply like a public choice lens, you're looking at the incentives of politician. It is towards winning the next election. It is towards populism, and it is towards short-termism, doing what is attributable, and etc., etc. And at the same time, if you look at the incentives of bureaucrats, as Parkinson's law famously says, every bureaucrat wants to expand his budgets and have more people under him. So if you just take a cynical view of the world like that, you think that, hey, nothing can possibly change. Now, change has happened. Some of the change, external events like the crisis of 91 might have played a small part in it, but the fact of the matter, and I've had many episodes about this, is that the 91 reforms were in the making since the late 70s.
Yeah.
When Manmohan got Montek back, and for years and years, these people silently worked behind the scenes, and so much really happened. And, I'll link in the show notes to an episode of Everything is Everything called The Reformers, which is about exactly this. But my slightly cynical question to Ajay often is that my sense is that when I think about this long line of reformers from Manmohan and Montek to whoever the last reformers were, it seems that these are individuals within the system who, we are lucky to have them, but they are fundamentally outliers. That the way the system is, you will have bureaucratic sclerosis, you will have a status quo bias within the within the political class, or even worse, a drive to populism, and nothing will really get done. And even if a politician wants to get things done, he might not be able to because the bureaucracy gets in the way. A recent guest of on this show, in fact, told me that people blame Modi Shah for so much. The fact is, Modi Shah might do one or two signature things, but basically the deep state is running everything. Now you can look at this as a positive or a negative, but it's also a sign of how difficult it is to kind of get things done. And added to that is, I think, the complexity in these modern times, where back in the day, you had politicians across parties understanding when something was a good idea and letting it happen. Like the new pension scheme, the NPS, was prepared under the Vajpayee government, who left it for the next dispensation, and then Manmohan and Chidambaram were all for it. Similarly, inflation targeting was, again, the document was prepared under the Chidambaram ministry in 2014, and as a courtesy, because there were elections, he left it for the next guy, and Mr. Jaitley immediately said, let's do it, it's a great idea. And my episode with KP Krishnan has the details of this and is quite mind-blowing. And that is over. Whether it is over because something has fundamentally changed in our politics, or whether we just happen to have the wrong set of politicians in place, I don't know. But it is over to the point that today the opposition will reflexively and unthinkingly oppose everything the government does, and vice versa. And you cannot, it seems that movement is impossible. And the farm laws being a classic example. Now, again, Ajay and I have an episode on that. It was, in political terms, the way it was carried out, it was a disaster. The way the government treated the protesters was, deeply wrong and not something that should happen in a democracy. But the reforms were great and needed. They were, in fact, part of the Congress manifesto, but they were opposed because, hey, the opposition had to oppose everything the government did. Similarly, I think there's been consensus among economists that our labor laws need reform. We've had this consensus for decades that they harm workers more than they help them. They keep the country poor. And yet, because it was Adityanath who did labor law reform in UP, there was this reflexive anger from everybody who opposes Adityanath, saying that, hey, people who've not studied the actual issue and what the laws are for 30 seconds. So, in a sense, it's a triple worry, different sources of cynicism towards change. That one, what are the incentives of politicians? Let's look at them. Two, consider the way the deep state is structured and what the incentives are within that. And three, the political environment today. So what is sort of your sense? Because you've actually been within that world and you've managed to get a fair amount of incremental reform done.
So, first of all, I'll just start off with the public choice view, and I think the public choice view, when it came to prominence in the 50s, etc., it was a very welcome shift, because otherwise there was almost a naive view that the government works for social welfare, and by drilling down to, as you say, the individual incentives. But I think the public choice guys overplay their hand, because if you take at one point of time, you see this permanent lock of special interests, but over a period of time, you see that change does happen. So, if you read like Mansoor Olson, economists I really like, on this Eurosclerosis sort of issue,
Logic of collective action.
You think that nothing is going to happen, but people, over a period of time actually think so. I think that the fact is that the public choice view overstates the ability of interest groups to understand the future. If you say that there are uncertainties in the future, or deep uncertainties, then you actually have a opening for change. So in fact, it's interesting that Buchanan, in his book, Calculus of Consent, right, actually talks about this veil of uncertainty, which is very close to Rawls's veil of ignorance. So I think once you say uncertainty, I don't know as a interest group, assuming that the interest group can think collectively rather than what my interests over 20 years are. So people do change course, there's a learning. So I think that the public choice, while important, I think is too dark a view. I think ideas have especially during crises when uncertainty is very high, ideas matter. And this is the entire idea of the Overton window, etc. I'm quite sure inflation targeting, it was coming off this massive surge in Indian inflation, which made inflation targeting particularly attractive to Mr. Jaitley. And so that is one. But coming back to India, so change does happen. I think that my experience is that at every point of time in the system, there are reform champions. It's not just in politics, in economics. I think that I've seen enough bureaucrats who, they're not a majority, right? But I've seen enough bureaucrats who want change. But my firm belief is that politicians are the entrepreneurs, means I think it is the politician who takes the risk. And if you speak to any of these reformers, they'll tell you that end of the day, it is the man who has the government position. So whether it is Narasimha Rao, whether it is Mr. Vajpayee, whether it is Manmohan Singh, whether it is Narendra Modi, I think eventually it is their big call, So I'm not pessimistic about change. I think change happens, but change happens in like bursts, rather than because of these various factors. But I think the bureaucrat, the outside academic, all are important. But I think it's the political entrepreneur who actually is at some point of time saying that, I'm going to take this big risk.
Yeah, and that's a very wise point, and the nuance about incentives there, which you can reconcile public choice theory with the fact that change does happen, is that just as individuals contain multitudes, people respond to a multiplicity of incentives. So a bureaucrat is not only responding to the one narrow incentive of bigger department, bigger budgets, but also that, hey, I can actually make a fucking difference to this country. And what incentive could be bigger than that if you are aligned to think in those ways?
I've seen some. And in fact, may not want to name that bureaucrat because she's junior in the system, so I don't know how it all works there. But just at the district level, so many young bureaucrats have brought about change. So I don't think we should. As I said, Amit, over the years, from starting with this standard Indian middle class view that every politician is useless, every bureaucrat is useless, everybody is a rent seeker, I have substantially changed my view over the past 20 years.
I mean, I had an episode with one such enterprising bureaucrat called Ashutosh Salil a few months back. And my question to him was, look, I love the stuff that you've done. You're amazing. But I fear that you're an outlier. And I think that, like my view of the design of a good system is a good system is one in which even the worst person produces good results because the incentives are right. And that systemic design worries me, but we'll come back to that. But I'll double click on the point you made about politicians being the key drivers of change. And my sense there is that, look, politicians, as you said, they are entrepreneurs in the political marketplace, right? But they are the supply responding to demand. To me, the demand is critical. The demand is what really matters. So how much, what do you think about that demand side of the political marketplace?
So the demand side obviously is not necessarily so I, if I may disagree with you, Amit, I think the hallmark of an entrepreneur is that he or she takes that risk, not necessarily knowing that there is demand. You create a market for whatever you're producing, right? So I think that a really good politician who has the ability to sell a program or to communicate a program can actually get the public mood behind him or her. So I don't think a really talented politician is necessarily only a hostage to the immediate political demands of his constituency. I think he can he or she can reshape. And we've seen that, right? We've seen politicians reshape things ahead of what their societies perhaps are ready for.
Can you give me examples of that within an Indian context and within the specific context that a lot of the economic ideas that we talk about are deeply counterintuitive, like spontaneous order, which you still haven't told me a Marathi word for, or
Homework, Amit.
homework, or the positive sumness of things. And yet people in general, by and large, because of rational ignorance, etc., tend to think of the world in zero-sum ways. They tend to think of redistribution as a solution to problems of poverty, etc. So, there is no constituency, for example, for the kind of deep-seated agricultural reforms that we need. It's a small constituency. Maybe Sharad Joshi for a while led a movement that had some of that was on the right track. But all the demands will come for what is a short-term anesthetic, perhaps a necessary short-term anesthetic, but an anesthetic regardless of farm loan waivers, which then becomes a hygiene factor. So everybody's really offering that. It's not making a dent on the problem. It's creating moral hazard. And the deeper issues are not addressed because a politician can say that, hey, we've done this. So in a positive sense, when you talk about a politician actually creating a demand for policies that you and I would consider good, what examples come to mind?
Just stick to farm laws, right? It was a big political risk. Means it was, if you had just taken the calculation that, people will not accept it, but they did move ahead. Yeah, means you have to, all labor laws, these are these are the most difficult ones, right? I think the 91 reforms, full respect for everything done, were executive decisions, right? Means, do you want to decontrol import of gold? Do you want to, cut your fiscal deficit? But once you go to these factor markets, it's extremely complicated political economy out there. And see, sometimes, Amit, also, it's not just people are stupid. See, especially the poor, you have to understand that the risk-taking abilities of the poor are very low, means, or to use technical language, their discount rates are very high, So I really, when I'm living hand to mouth, I cannot take the risk with something which says that in 5 years, your life will be better because of this. I don't have that time frame to my life, So these are some of the practical problems, but I think just the farm laws, means the fact that the Prime Minister took that risk tells us something. Now, you may say that, should it have been done by Delhi or should it have been done at the state level? Those are valid things, but I think that was, an attempt of exactly what I'm saying.
So here's another question about change. 20 years back, I would have thought slightly simplistically that the state of things is A, and the ideal state of things is B. And if you have a correct sort of confluence of bureaucrats and politicians and things working in tandem, you can just shift A to B. Now, that is clearly not the case, right? So even if you look at something like the farm laws, you look at doing away with APMCs, right? We agree that doing away with APMCs is of massive good to the farmer. Effectively, what is happening because of APMCs is that you are creating both a monopoly and a monopsony. The farmer can only sell to an APMC, and a buyer can only buy from the APMC. So the farmer will sell something for 2 rupees, the retail customer will get it for 20 rupees, while the farmer could have got 10 rupees and the retail customer could have paid 12 rupees, right? Very standard, and it's an easy economic case. But when you come to it in the real world, you run into two kinds of problems. One is that you have the people who are benefiting from the current system, either people who are benefiting from the current system or people who are surviving within the current system and have that uncertainty कि नए सिस्टम में क्या होगा मुझे कुछ पता नहीं, and therefore you are kind of, that becomes a hassle. And two, even if you can implement the law, the way the ecosystem is set up is that it might seem for a long time that nothing is happening or there's a disruption, and that disruption itself can be harmful, and these are really complicated sort of wicked problems. So what is your sense of how one goes about this? Because these are so complicated that at one level my mind boggles when I think about what are the incremental changes I begin with? What is even the process of change? Because I know what is the ideal end state, but getting to there from here involves just so many uncertainties.
Yeah, so I think this is again, this first generation, second generation, third generation reforms. The first generation reforms were the clean break from the past, but they were executive decisions. The second generation, like especially electricity markets, telecom, the big oligopolistic sectors, they were more complicated. You had to, also many of them you had to take state governments into account. I think really these third generation, especially of factor markets, they're going to be very, very difficult. Means if there's one area where I'm generally an optimist, but one area where I think that it's going to be so I think the optimum strategy in such a thing, because especially given what happened with the farm laws, is to chip away, by incrementally reducing, like even labor laws, very states have in their own way included elements of flexibility into labor laws. I think it's going to be a slow burn battle. I don't think you're going to see a day where you wake up one day and say, oh, Indian labor laws have been overhauled. Happy to be proven wrong, but I don't think it's because all land, labor, and agriculture is not exactly a factor market, but land, labor markets, and I think we've seen that there have been attempts, but they're very, very messy. So,
what is the fundamental driver of the people within an organization like Artha? Because it seems to me that at one level, if you were a pure research organization, you can say, hey, the pursuit of truth, and that can kind of drive you forward. Within Artha, the thing is that it's the pursuit of truth towards a particular end, and that end will only be partly achieved at best, and you will get no credit for it when it happens, and nothing is attributable, and you are essentially playing the long game. But even if you succeed, you will not know you have succeeded, and you certainly can't take credit for your success. So how does that sort of play out?
I think the first thing is that, as you said, it is a long game, right? Means we're not a patch on what the Kelkars and the Monteks and the Rangarajans did, but literally, it's year after year they kept at it. In fact, look at GST, right? 2002, the idea was floated in the budget of 2002, or rather announced, and in 2017 we actually, so 15 years. So it's a fair thing about how some things move, in the system. So I think it's a long game. So you have to be patient. Number two is that our idea is that we have to work with governments. End of the day, the government of India is the biggest potential change maker in this country. So working with the government, working with at least within reform champions within the government, I think that's the second. I don't think we know that we will not get credit, and it's not that our research or our thing has single-handedly shifted the needle, right? I think there are lots of people working in similar areas, but that's okay. I don't think the idea is that you should, get some great recognition, etc. I think if you see some change and that change builds on some earlier change, I think that's good enough.
So, another of the sort of factoids that came about your dad was that he was involved with this great magazine called Abhiruchi, and he wrote a column for them called Vaad Samvad for 10 years. So, like you were columnist, but many decades before you, obviously, and I'm sure much, much better. But and there's no trace of that column online, obviously. At least I couldn't find it. Maybe you have a copy somewhere. But that got me to thinking about journalism per se, about how transient journalism can be, columns can be, a lot that is in the world of ideas can be. And recently, when I think of creators or writers or whatever, much as economists talk of money in terms of stock and flow, I've been thinking about what we do in terms of stock and flow. That in a sense, the columns, the podcast episodes, etc., they are the flow. They are your constant engagement with the world. You're putting something out. Maybe you get feedback, maybe you don't, but it's just a constant flow. It is necessarily transient. It is bound to piece of, it's timely and it's of a particular time and place. So I try my best to make my episodes timeless in a sense with these sort of oral history type life and times episodes. But it's like a flow. And on the other hand, there is a stock where people are building up bodies of work, which again, in that sedimentary way they form, they continue to increase a bedrock of knowledge on which a future generation can rest. And my complaint about a lot of my friends in this world is that you guys haven't written enough books. Like Ajay and Vijay, of course, wrote In Service of the Republic, and that is one such book which is part of that bedrock. Karthik's just written a book on engaging with the state and policy, just from that one prism. Pranay Kotasune keeps writing what appears to be 2 books a week. So there is, some work happening, but My sense is that we need kind of more of a stock. You wrote one book, The Rise of India, in 2007, of course, and you mentioned you're writing another book now, so I'll ask you about that also shortly. But in a broader sense, tell me about how within this ecosystem of ideas, how important is it to also create this stock? Because the complaint that I will have of all of you, and the last time I hung out with Ruben in the Artha office, I was telling him the same thing, that I have met few people as brilliant and wide-ranging as that, yet where are the fucking books? What have you left of yourself? At the very least, come on my show and do an 8-hour episode. But in general, I just feel that that is a positive, because many people will, including many people listening to this, will get interested in a particular aspect of what you've said, and they'll say, Amit, I want to, and I get this question all the time, that Amit, I want to learn more about this. Maybe it's the economic history of India or whatever, and suggest a book. And 90% of the time I realize there is no book that I can suggest, that through osmosis and living and conversations like this, I have picked up whatever half-baked knowledge I have, but there is no one source. So what's your sense of this ecosystem of ideas, and do you agree with me that there is, a lack here that has to be filled?
Guilty as charged. I see, first of all, one thing I'm clear about is my columns will never be a book, because, columns are transient. Some friends do say that, within that you've written some like economics have fun or some economic history ones which are timeless, So, some of these fun columns or some of these offbeat columns, which perhaps at some point I may expand and put them. But generally, I don't think column writing, it's for the moment, it's transient. So that's the first thing, I don't think I'm interested in converting my columns as such. Who knows, maybe I'll put some together, but at some point, I don't think that's... See, about book writing, I think you have to have something to say, because I'm very cognizant of the fact that great books are written by scholars, and I think I have extreme clarity in my mind that scholarship is something different from engaging writing, So I think the sort of work which goes into books, I think I need to inculcate the discipline, and you have to say something to say, which is, because, there is otherwise just non-fiction books keep coming and going, So there's really no point in just putting one for the sake of your CV. So my own thing is that I need to be confident I have something to add to the existing stock of knowledge, and then whether I have the discipline to write it.
I am very, 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 and I don't use the word very, as you know, writers should not use words
like very. If I was the editor, I would have cancelled those veries.
You would have cancelled me only, like not one very, this bugger is using 15 veries, sack him. But one thing that I want to push back strongly on is this notion of something to say, because, the thing is, what many of us tend to do is we suffer from the curse of knowledge, that something seems incredibly obvious to us, so we assume ki baki sabko pata hoga. It's stating the obvious, it is so banal, why should I say this? And yet, as many of my listeners will know, that often I will say something that I feel is completely commonplace, and yet somebody will write to me and say, man, TIL, it really opened my eyes. And for that reason, I feel that people like you and other intellectuals within the system should never take our knowledge for granted, that it is of value to put it out there in a systematic manner.
So again, Avinash Dikshit, so there's one essay he wrote on his research style, and he says somewhere that he says there are marathon runners, there are middle distance runners, and there are sprinters, and he said that I'm a middle distance runner. And then I moved. The marathoners take one question and then they pursue it for the rest of their lives. The middle distance runners, after 5 years, they move to some new thing. And also, I think I've been a sprinter. I've got a fundamentally roaming mind, a distracted mind. So I'm very happy every, fortnight to pursue some other thing. I need to perhaps at some point figure out how to become a middle distance runner.
At the risk of Niranjan's planning, may I postulate that while in your output it might appear that you have been a sprinter, in your interests and in what you have been taking in, you have very much been a marathon runner. For example, if you look at something like economic history, you have been a marathon runner, you have that, and that is kind of, your next book kind of covers that also. Would you like to?
I haven't told too many people, but maybe I should. So I'm working on a book on the history of economic ideas in India. See, there are lots of books on Western economic thinking, right? So, classics include Worldly Philosophers by Robert Heilbronner, and then I said Galbraith's book, and you keep.
Larry White has a great book on the history of
Yes,
economic
but I
ideas.
don't think there is enough of that on Indian economic thinkers, and I really don't want to go back to Kautilya and this thing. The Mahabharata has lectures in the, I think, Shanti Parva on governance. I don't want to go back that. I'm basically talking about the modern era, and I'm trying to connect them with specific points of India's economic history. So it's being thought, yeah, but that's the book I really want to do. I mean, I find it quite amazing that even students of economics, and this goes back to my training in Bombay University back then, they're not, they don't know much about Indian economic thinking. Means who has read a Sukhumai Chakravarti, who has read a V.K. Ramaswamy, who has, I mean, these names, and these people, just to give a random example, B.S. Minhas, Bagicha Singh Minhas, right? Minhas wrote a paper with Kenneth Arrow, Robert Solow, and Hollis Chenery, right? Means the four people who wrote it, two of them got Nobels, right? And it was built on Minas's own PhD thesis. So that was the quality of, and then he came back and joined the government of India. So, these people are really not known, so we know some of the debates around the Mahalanobis plan, but we don't know, like, even Ambedkar, one of the first trained economists, like, do we really know his economic ideas? In the interwar period, there were so many economists, Jahangir, Koyaji, I think these are just names. So the idea is to write a book on Indian economists, economic thinking, and link it to Indian economic history.
Absolutely can't wait. It'll be educational. And speaking of educational, another question I want to ask you is about the ecosystem of ideas within India and disseminating these ideas. Like, you're on the advisory board of the Meghna Desai Academy, as you pointed out. You're on the board of trustees for Center for Civil Society. You have helped in creating the economics curriculum for Mumbai School of Economics and Public Policy, Ramnarayan Roya College, Wellington Institute of Management, etc., etc. So you've got your fingers into these different worlds. Equally, you work in Artha. Equally, of course, within this world, we are all friends with each other. Takshashila is doing an incredible job out there in Bangalore, both in terms of, housing scholars like Pranay and Anupam and Manoj, who are just remarkable, and Nitin himself, of course, but also training, hundreds of thousands of people and, building that world of ideas, that ecosystem of ideas. So what is your sense of the way it has grown? Because, from when you would have started your career, it would practically have been zero,
Yeah.
maybe in, the Mumbai School of Economics where maybe there's a different kind of line there, but geographically it's one little campus with a handful of profs, maybe I'm imagining, and not really more than that. But today it is an entire burgeoning ecosystem of people who are training other people, who are writing op-eds, who are blogging, who are doing podcasts, etc., etc. So give me a sense of all of this.
Yeah, it's definitely deepened. So more think tanks, more people. I think also, some of this new policy thinking has broken out of the walls of academia or just government organization, right? Once upon a time, it was all concentrated like within some sort of an ivory tower. I think this broader, ecosystem, I think, is extremely important. It's still early days, it's still fragile, so I don't think it has the depth of what you see in many other countries, but it's welcome. And Amit, your podcast, right, means there is so much in that podcast, which, like, if I was teaching, I would actually recommend it, many of the episodes, to students, so I think that has changed. I think what worries me, Amit, is the decline of public universities, and I'll tell you why. We have all these new think tanks are small, means, but we have the growth of these private universities, etc. But I think the public university has the deepest connect to the average citizen, means, I have a friend of mine from the Mumbai economics department had told me once. He said that like the student, like when a Dalit student from Marathwada or Central Maharashtra comes, very poorly trained at his undergrad thing, he comes here for a master's degree, and we sort of take a lot of trouble, and then he joins Citibank. He says that is when you feel achievement. If you're, I think what happening is a lot of the private universities, there is an element of self-selection. That you anyway taking people from the cream of society, and very often they are headed abroad. So I think the means as much as I'm not at all saying that you should not have private universities. India needs more universities. India needs more think tanks, research organizations, etc. But I think the decline of the public university is very important, and you see that means so much of now the best Indian economists are now sitting in foreign universities, and I don't know what it will take to bring many of them back. The second, I think, is platforms. I think India does not have really top quality journals, and what's happened is these big so-called top 5 journals, they are dominated by a few universities, Western universities. So EPW used to be that, but so I think that has to be strengthened. I think you need to rebuild public universities or build new public universities. You need more conferences, you need more journals, and then this entire flowering of podcasting, of op-ed writing, that's always welcome.
If anybody from Ashoka is listening to this, please write in and tell me if it's true what I've heard, that Ashoka is basically woke rich kid smoking ganja all day. So
I didn't say that.
No, you never said that, but obviously, but others have said it in exactly so many words. So I wonder if that's true, I asked mischievously. And obviously, universities also contain multitudes. So I'm sure it's not entirely true, but it's at least partly
No, it's
true.
not entirely true. So, let me, since you're being the troublemaker that you are, let me backpedal a bit. I don't mean every professor, but I think generally the private universities are welcome, but they can't cover up for the decline of public universities.
No, I absolutely agree. And even for Ashoka, I've had people like Ashwini Deshpande on my show and other Ashoka profs, and at least those of the faculty who've been on my show are awesome, but that could be the selection bias because after all, they have been on my show. And there's a larger kind of problem there. When you mentioned that a lot of Indian, like what I see is a lot of elite rich kids will go to foreign universities and they will come back brainwashed in the ways that foreign universities do, and their ideas will often have no relevance to this world. And even when they are well-meaning and they haven't been brainwashed, there'll be a lot of isomorphic mimicry at work. They won't have risen up from the ground. And I feel that the future of India lies really in young people in small towns. And then the question is, how do you empower those young people with small towns, not just with economic growth, but also with access to knowledge? And certainly public universities are a part of that, and certainly whatever other disruptive solutions emerge.
So I think also then, circling back to our initial discussions on bilingualism, I think it's very, so, Amit, whenever I write for Lok Satta, which is the Marathi paper, and I don't write very frequently, I'm astonished at the reader response, because sometimes when you write in a Mint or something, it's preaching to the converted, and I think sometimes if you write for I think it's very important. In fact, many years ago, if Mr. S.V. Raju, who kept the flag of the Swatantra Party flying against all odds, Mr. Raju and I would keep discussing this, that how do we actually, reach out to, Marathi speakers, Gujarati speakers, Kannada speakers, etc., with economic liberalism, with political liberalism, etc. And I think that's also very important. I think that the reach of these videos, etc., is very, very important. So it need, as I said, even the growth of intellectual output outside the university system is a good thing. But I agree with you. I think small town India is really something to admire and watch out for. And I think if I may share an anecdote from a unusual source. So I don't know if you've seen this Netflix documentary on the Yashraj movies called Dream Merchants.
I hated it. Yeah, I've seen
Okay,
it.
so fine. So at one point, Aditya Chopra says that, after liberalization, the first round of films they made were the typical NRI films, the Shah Rukh Khan NRI market films. And then he said sometime in the late, 2000 to 2010 period, they pivoted towards small town themes, the sort of the bunty or bubbly type of themes. And he said because that's where he saw a lot of change and new things. So I think it's interesting, I think this is the broader story of the transformation of India, where it's no longer, and to use another like unusual example, look at the cricket team, right? It means when I grew up, the cricket team was largely metro boys. And today you just see the composition of this cricket team. It's astonishing. And everywhere you look at our space program, you look at our athletics, you look at our, people coming from diverse backgrounds, which you wouldn't have expected 30 years ago.
So, just on Bollywood, a slight tangential point I often make, and I made this when TikTok first came. I was, until it got banned, unfortunately, I was a big champion of TikTok because I felt that what was happening before that was that just as our government in India is too central, entertainment was too centralized. Like the Hindi cinema entertainment was too centralized in Bombay, and there were really two groups of people who were kind of running it. One is the kids of all the producers of the past who'd gone abroad, studied, come back, had a shallow understanding of society. And one is the older producer directors who had a shallow understanding of the market, as it were. And for me, TikTok was a bottom-up expression of what the country really feels and, wants to be and wants to be entertained by. Yeah. And it kind of got nipped in the bud, which I felt was tragic.
I don't want to rant on Bollywood because I watch a lot of Bollywood films, but it's quite amazing, that so many actors and actresses in Bollywood who basically earn their living from the Hindi language cannot speak the Hindi language. Yeah. And I'm astonished. And if you compare it with, say, the generation of Raj Kapoor or Dilip, or even Amitabh Bachchan, I think it's quite astonishing, this sort of, divergence from the realities of India.
I mean, for anybody listening, and I'll think aloud here, but for any young person listening who can solve this problem, I feel that there is a tremendous lag here. Like in many industries, the mainstream has crumbled, but new paradigms haven't emerged to replace the old paradigm, and there is a lag in that. And I think what is happening in cinema is this, that in other medium, like music, for example, you could say that, okay, you might have a Taylor Swift and whatever who are super popular, but by and large, you have this expression of the long tail. You have creators who found 1,000 true fans or 1 lakh true fans or whatever the case might be, and you have people who found miniature markets, niche markets, they're all profitable, they're all doing well. It is a mystery to how you do that in cinema, because traditionally the barrier to entry has been huge because production costs were so incredibly high, and then the distribution. I feel that in terms of production costs being incredibly high, that matter has kind of gotten sorted out. Like there is this great documentary I was watching by Wim Wenders called, I think it's Sweet 360, Sweet 666, something like that, or 366 or whatever. It's on Mubi. I'll link it from the show notes, where in 1982 at the Cannes Film Festival, he gets a bunch of directors to sit down and talk about their fears for cinema. And all of them are, kind of already they sound absurd today. Like Spielberg says that, look, I took 8 million to make E.T. I am worried that 8 years later, I might have to spend 20 million to make E.T., even though it is shot only in a house and a backyard and one shot in a forest. And the truth is, today you could probably do it for 10 lakhs. Yeah. Literally. So that barrier has changed, but the barrier of distribution, the barrier of how you find that long tail, how you find your niches, how you build a profitable business model, that is a mystery, and I think that it is a problem waiting to be solved, and whoever solves it is really the next Amazon or the next YouTube or the next big success story.
Yeah, that's true. Although, to be fair, OTT has provided a platform. Like 20 years ago, a film like Lapata Ladies may not have got a theater release, and here it is today, I think, one of the top grossing or most watched movies. So, but I think this goes back to the thing that change comes not from pricing, but change often comes from new technologies which entrepreneurs bring in, new ways of doing business, new demographic segments. So it's like what you could call exogenous shocks which actually change, things.
So, at the risk of getting sacked for the second time in an episode by you, I'm going to say very 20 times again and say that I am very, very, very into 20 times passionate about one thing that you said, which is the importance of the languages, of getting content out in the languages, because within English, you have all the content of the world available to you. Whereas within the languages, you don't have the same richness in the ecosystem. And that's where the hunger for information is more. And it is there that the change makers of future India will come from. So my question to you, therefore, my very pointed question, Niranjan, is that within the intellectual life, and I know you wouldn't want to use such a sort of, the phrase almost seems too grand, the intellectual life, but within the intellectual life that you've lived, you've been a curator, you've been a writer, you've been a thinker, you've been a researcher, you've tried to get things done in whatever ways Artha is enabled. But what you haven't done is you haven't been a popularizer, in the sense that 90% of your knowledge you would probably take for granted. Curse of knowledge, you would think, it's so obvious, it's banal. I would argue it is not, it is very important. And I would find that there is perhaps great value in people like yourself saying that, no, I will do a Marathi YouTube station. It doesn't have to have fancy values, but there is nobody else in that language talking about these ideas in these ways. And obviously your first best solution is that some young kid from a small town from Satara comes and has a superstar channel with all your ideas and everything is great, and that's what would be the dream. But you and I know economics policy, first best solutions, Niranjan, don't come about. And to me, I think that a lot of people in the intellectual world, including you, including just absolutely anyone I can think of, doesn't think this is worth doing, but oh my god, this is the one thing worth doing, especially in languages. So, you know.
So, Amit, I said early on that I'm lazy, and now I see that there's some conspiracy you are building against me. First, you say write a book. Now you're saying start a YouTube channel. Not fair, not fair. I thought friends are not supposed to do this.
No, our mutual friend Ajay Shah says that everyone's going to live till 120. So you have half your life yet to go, and
Yes.
all of these are doable. No, but I'm serious.
Genuinely, I've one of the thoughts I've had is not so much doing it myself, but I know lots of, again, given my limit world, it's more on economics, but I know a lot of friends who are economists who are pretty good at, they've either studied at Marathi school or they write Marathi well, of trying to get some sort of explainers, I remember like I had written in Lok Satta a piece on this new pension scheme and, this entire thing about going back to the old pension scheme. And I didn't even say this was good or that was bad. I just did an explainer and a fact check for Maharashtra, that what is the pension bill of the Maharashtra government, what are the tax revenues look like. And I was quite surprised, there is a hunger for this information. So let's see. I don't like the way this is going. You're adding more and more work for me, but
purpose. I'm adding more and more purpose. No, but I'm being selfish in a sense. I really think this is worth doing, if whether you do it alone or you get together with your friends or whatever. And I'm sure funding would be super easy to find. And there is no greater bang for the buck. To everyone who is putting money on content in English, I would just say that, man, the bang for the buck for Marathi or Hindi or any Indian language is 100x.
Yeah.
So you got to kind of do it. So, before I wrap up, I want to ask you a question about the current time. It's 12 June when we are recording right now. This episode will probably be out in 3 weeks or something. Give me a sense of what you feel about the economy as it stands today. Like, a lot of the bickering that we see on mass media is about this policy or that policy. Is devoid of frameworks, it's devoid of a broader understanding. So give me a broader understanding that does the Indian economy make you feel optimistic, pessimistic? What are the worries? What is your sense of where we stand today?
Yeah, so let's look at it this way, Amit, that India is in the midst of 3 big transitions, right? And that's the general story of structural transformation. The first is the transition from farms to factories and offices, right? Means people have to move to high productivity sectors. The second is the transition from informal enterprises to formal enterprises. And the third transition is from villages to cities, right? So basically the shift in productivity, that's a structural transformation. Now, India it's a halfway job yet. I am pretty optimistic about the Indian economy, So if you take the really long term, forget this government, previous government, etc., etc. If you assume that Indian growth took off in 1980, then over these 40 years or 40 plus years, we've averaged about 6.3 to 6.5 annual growth. There have been ups and downs, business cycles, shocks, etc. But that's the sort of thing. So I think that's not that's very, very creditable, but that's not a China-like growth. I guess that we will continue along this path, so maybe 6.5 becomes 7. I don't see 6.5 becoming 10 on a sustained basis. But even that will, definitely take us from what is currently a lower middle class, middle income country to a upper middle income country. So I would assume that by the early years of the next decade, India will be a upper middle income country. Now, the question really is that what will that mean, and this is a worry I have, and I've expressed this in columns over the past 10 years, that when India reaches that point, will it resemble East Asia or will it resemble Latin America? So East Asia, the growth was more inclusive. Latin America, it's a much different model. And I think the difference really is that in East Asia, they could create the jobs to pull people out, So I think that is the key thing, that how do we create jobs? How do we offer opportunities to people to make these shifts, from, as I said, from farm to factory, from informal to formal, so if we can't make these, then there's a large class of people stuck in like small enterprises, living. And this has profound implications for other things also, because if we can't provide jobs as the main tool or the main vehicle of inclusion, then the other option then becomes welfare, right? So you then have all the pressures on your fiscal system, etc. So I think this question, which East Asia or Latin America has been troubling me for some time, unfortunately, we seem to be headed towards Latin America, not 100%, but that's the sign. So I think that is something. See, the other thing which makes me confident about the Indian economy otherwise on a macro basis is that if you think about over the years since independence, the structural impediments to Indian growth. So we had a food constraint, we had a savings constraint, we had a balance of payments constraint, and we had an energy constraint. Now, gradually these have come down. So the food constraint was broken by the Green Revolution. So today, even if you have one bad monsoon, the Indian economy doesn't go into a tumble, or we don't go to the IMF. The, post-bank nationalization, the savings constraint has eased a lot. Domestic savings have climbed. And the foreign exchange constraint, because of the 91 reforms opening up, you have money coming in. What remains is the energy constraint. And I think I always say that Indian macro when oil is at 50 and Indian macro when oil is at 150 is a completely different thing. So the reason for optimism is that if this green transition and the rise of alternate sources of energy, etc., does play out over the next 10 years, we'll have broken the energy constraint also. So these major supply side constraints then become much easier. So I think now with this, I think much of the debate will have to pivot to the demand side, that who then buys everything. So, is it going to be foreigners through exports? Is it going to be domestic consumers? But then how do domestic consumers do it if there's no job creation? Government has its fiscal constraints. There are, of course, now corporate investment. So I think generally I'm positive, but I think that we have to think about now in the next 10 years a different sort of set of structural issues for the Indian economy.
There's an episode of Everything is Everything, a link from the show notes, where Ajay gave a masterclass on the future of electricity and how we can kind of reform that. So I share that optimism. Let me ask you one more question. Like one of Land Pritchett's sort of great findings and something that animates him and drives him, and I share the fervor, is about the role of growth in getting people out of poverty. Like he studied the trajectory of a whole bunch of countries with a whole bunch of different policies across the decades. And the one factor that is responsible for 99% of people's rise out of poverty is a per capita GDP, which is essentially what growth is delivering to you. So welfare schemes and redistribution are less than 1% of the puzzle. All of it will come from growth. Like you said, jobs are critical. Jobs will only come from growth. You can't, redistribute jobs per se. And in much of the Indian discourse, the easy answer of welfareism, that kind of zero-sum thinking, it's just pervasive. You look at the latest Congress manifesto, for example, it's all about wealth tax redistribution, zero-sum thinking, which is missing the point entirely. Even this government, I would argue, has just been far too statist, and a lot of the credit for the 2019 win, in fact, went to welfare delivery. And all of that is okay, fine, you do welfare delivery, but your jobs, your economic growth, getting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty is only going to come from growth, which...
So I completely agree with Land Pritchett, means eventually it's growth, right? And it's not just per capita, it's not just, all development indicators, whether it's, longevity, child mortality,
Everything is correlated to
malnutrition,
growth.
everything. It's like, if you were to draw a line of best fit, it is almost about 45 degrees. So I completely agree that we have to, I think that, we need some welfare system, but as a backstop. It can't be your first line of attack. It has to be has to be a backstop if things fail, if things go badly. But I don't see how India is going to offer adequate opportunities for 1.5 billion people, most of them young, if we don't have job creating growth.
So, as we start winding up, my sort of penultimate question is that if I ask you to look like 15 years into the future, and I'm not asking for a prediction here, but if I ask you to look 15 years into the future, what is kind of your best case scenario for where we could be and your worst case scenario for where we could be?
My best case scenario is that India will continue to grow at this sustained rate of 6.5-7%, which I continue to say is not a small achievement. If you look at the history of the world or even post-world, like lot of countries have grown, but as you climb up the income, or as you go closer towards that frontier, it becomes harder and harder to increase productivity, right? So you see that richer countries by definition grow at 2%, or just grow slower than. So the catch up will end at some point of time, and then you will have to have another set of very, significant reforms to make the next push, so this infamous middle income trap, we're no longer there yet, but maybe by 2035 we'll have to figure out ways. So I think that's a big question. I am confident of that India will continue to progress. I'm not a India pessimist by any stretch of imagination, but sometimes what happens, Amit, is that we settle into hubris, means this, we are the fastest growing economy in the world, is that. But I think the question is that at this stage, what was the rate of growth in Korea or China? At this level of income, they were like doing 8 to 10% sustained growth. So it depends on how you sort of slice the cake, or how do you look at the problem. So hubris it's a touchy-feely thing, but I think we should not be hubristic. I continue to be confident or optimistic, and I think we'll reach that position of middle income, where the middle income trap kicks in about 10 years from now, and maybe you start thinking now about how to avoid that trap.
It would be a most delightful trap to reach. Just
I don't, if you look at Barry Eichengrein's pieces, on the middle income trap, largely it kicks in at about 15,000 per capita income, PPP. India is about 9,000. So it's not that
far.
It's not that far, yeah. So, if you assume that broadly 5% growth per capita per year, that's maybe 5-10 years, and 10 years later.
Okay, let's
But optimism, underlying is optimism.
underlying is optimism. So, my underlying optimism for my next question is that you will take at least 1 hour to answer it, because I know that your answer can be very rich. Which is, I'm going to ask you to give me and my listeners recommendations for books, films, music that you love. And I'm actually going to go out on a limb and say that please feel free to recommend books, films, music that I can't exactly consume because they're in Marathi. I don't mind Marathi recommendations, because there must be many Marathi listeners who would love to be introduced to, that rich cultural world that, maybe they miss something there. So
Yeah, so
feel free to read out your favorite poems, to sing your favorite songs.
I don't want to drive away people with my voice, but okay. So as I said, as much as I read Marathi, I still English dominates my reading, because partly because of the subject. I read more non-fiction, and I read more of economics and cricket sort of stuff, and I like crime thrillers as well. So let me just like list out randomly some of the books I've really liked. I mentioned Tony Judd's Post-War. I don't know. Recently, I read this very nice book by Amitav Ghosh called Smoke and Ashes on the opium trade. It's a non-fiction book. Obviously he has this trilogy, right, on the opium trade. That I thought was wonderful. In Marathi books now, just I haven't prepared for this question. Yeah, this is like an school exam, where
Take your time.
you
Take your
don't
time.
prepare and then you say, "Oh, how do I bullshit my way through
Open
this?"
book. You can Google your notes.
Yeah. So recently, actually, this was something which came up on Twitter. I think on Independence Day, I think Salil Tripathi was asked to recommend books in Gujarati on freedom, etc. And I think somebody asked him that in that entire list, in that why were no Marathi books there? No Marathi person was. So he asked why. So there's one book at that point I had mentioned, which is not very well known, but it's a book called Sata Uttarachi Kahani, and it's a great book because it comes back to some of the points we discussed, that how friendship should transcend political views, etc. So it's by a person called, like in Marathi, Gopura Pradhan. He was again a professor at Ferguson College, your college actually. I don't know if you ever taught you. So he wrote this book sometime in the early 80s, and the theme is 8 friends, who grow up in the late 30s, early 40s, and then they all have different political beliefs. So one becomes a communist, one joins the RSS, one joins the Socialist Party, somebody joins Ambedkar, somebody joins the non-Brahmin movement, somebody becomes a Royist, somebody joins Vinoba Bhave. I think this covers 7. And there's an eighth friend who's apolitical, right? He's a writer. And I've never said this publicly, but my suspicion is that he's partly based on my father, because and that book, the way it is written is that he's built it on real events from Maharashtra's political history, and real people also walk in and out of it. So you actually have Ram Manohar Lohia coming into the story, Golwalkar Guruji coming into the story, and as I said, my father for a very short, brief moment. So I think it's an outstanding overview of Marathi, of the politics of Maharashtra broadly from 1940, like just before the Quit India movement, to around 1980, which is after the Janata experiment failed. So that's a book which, thanks to Twitter, it sort of came to my head. I think that's one good book. See, I always, think that we should read the classics in original, So I see lots of these debates about Nehru, Savarkar, Gokhale, Tilak, and my thing is that as far you can't read everybody in totality, right? But at least to get at least one book, one flavor of what somebody has said. I think I find, reading in Marathi as well in English, reading some of them, there's a particular way I think these should be read. So I think you should always read the old classics in the context of their times, first and foremost. Secondly, I think you should always judge a historical figure at his best or at his worst. What people do is they judge the person they like at his best and the person they dislike at his worst, I think. And the third is that if you find something which is obviously wrong, like think very hard, because these are people who have, immense intelligence and great achievement. So could they be that stupid? There must be something, so especially if you find something you disagree with, think harder. So, but I think reading all the classics as far as possible, not all the classics, that's too much, but so that's one.
Any specific ones you would recommend?
So I think at home I have in Marathi the collected works of Agarkar, of Tilak. I think some of Savarkar's own rationalist essays I really like, and
What can you tell us about Savarkar, which people who have read the English biographies wouldn't know?
yeah, so I wouldn't, sort of say anything or judge the English biographies. My point is that, Savarkar grew up in a very Marathi milieu, right? Means he had an extraordinary life. He was in international revolutionary circles. Then he was a national leader. But he also, I think, the way he came from was immensely important, and going back to that old 19th century great debate in Pune between the Sanatanis and the Sudharaks, so to say, or the political radicals and the social radicals would be a better way. I think what Savarkar did was he tried to break. I think he said this also. He says, I draw my political inspiration from Tilak and my social inspiration from Agarkar, which I think explains a lot, and I think, I see Savarkar in that context, that he was, he was sort of trying to bring these two things together. And I personally, although that Hindutva, Essential of Hindutva is his most famous book, it's not a book I particularly like, but I think some of his Marathi essays are very powerful, on politics, on social affairs. So really, someday, hopefully, and don't tell me, Niranjan, you should translate it. You are this is dangerous of, joining the Amit Verma show.
Maybe AI can translate it and you can edit it for context.
But I think some of this would be, I'm quite sure this is the same, means, I don't know, but maybe Lala Lajpat Rai wrote in, Urdu and Punjabi, or, there are maybe so many Bengali nationalists. So, I think that this Janki Bakhle's book in that sense tries to, or not tries, quite successfully sort of engages with the, not just Savarkar's Marathi writings, but Marathi scholarship on Savarkar. So there are three Savarkarite intellectuals whose books on Savarkar I've really liked. One is, I'll use the Marathi, way of saying it. One is Saha Deshpande, who was also an economist. The second is Shesharao More, and who's still a current writer. And the third is a thing called Dana Gokhale. And I think and I think for a critical view of Savarkar, Yadi Phadke's book on Shodh Savarkaran. So I think Marathi scholarship on Savarkar also is pretty sophisticated and worth reading. So yeah, so I think going back to my point about my sort of, I'm slightly partial towards rereading books rather than of course, it's not I don't read new books, because there are new things happening, new thoughts, new writers, but I like to reread books.
Movies, music?
Movies. So my tastes in movies are extremely lowbrow, so I'm not a big, I love the average Hollywood movie. I love the average Hindi movie, so I've enjoyed all right from the Navketan movies, which Devanand did, to sometimes the Govinda movies, to sometimes the, Amitabh Bachchan movies.
Look, nothing wrong with Govinda, Sarkari Khatiya Private Karo.
Yes. So I think he's not that every movie was good, but I think his comic timing was quite something. In English movies, I have a preference for political / historical movies and for crime thrillers, and
which ones in particular stand out?
Okay, so there's so many. In fact, recently I just rewatched the original version of Taking of Pelham 1, 2, 3, then the Batman series is actually all of Christopher Nolan's movies I like. In the current lot of thrillers, I like Sriram Raghavan a lot. I think I haven't seen Merry Christmas, but all of Sriram Raghavan's movies I've immensely enjoyed.
Have you met him?
No, never. And because Sriram Raghavan is a fan of Vijay Anand, who's another person I really like his movies.
So this is weird, no? So it's like you're in Bombay, he's in Bombay, he's like a top filmmaker, you're like a top economist and policy person and journalist. How come you haven't met? It's like different cities.
Yeah.
Yes,
Actually, another one which I liked is in the Hindi thrillers are few and far between, but I don't know if you've seen Manorama 6 Feet Under,
I
which
keep
is
meaning
very
to.
Chinatown flavor it has. But I think, Abhay Deol has done a absolutely astonishing part there. So, yeah, so my film tastes are like what you could call time pass, means I don't, I really don't, I'm not in a position to talk about, really high quality cinema. It's not my thing.
I don't believe in hierarchies again like
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
So
absolutely.
it's
So and it's true, means it's just like you can read a scholarly book and you can read Pulp Fiction at the same
I think
time.
you
I still love reading Agatha Christie. I still love reading, the Frederick Ford. As I said, the Nick Herron's that Slow House series I'm currently reading. So
I think you scratch different itches in different ways.
yeah. So, but I normally watch movies to relax, So I think you can just talk on and on. Music, unfortunately, I don't listen to much English music. Of course, being of certain age, there was some, 60s, 70s music I know, but my daughters try their best to educate me in English music, but I've always enjoyed Hindi cine music, both the old Hindi cine music and then the sort of, I think in between there was a period of awful music and then the Rahman, Shankar Ehsaan Loy, Amit Trivedi sort of music, Shantanu Maitra. I like that. And in the old times, they're all very good, but perhaps I would say Salil Chaudhary, R.D. Burman, yeah, these are my favorites.
So I will cheat and I will throw in a final question, as it were. And this is related to two F words, one of which just came up, another came up earlier, and now you've spoken about friendships. And just now you mentioned your daughters, so fatherhood being the F word there. So friendships and fatherhood, and what are the things that you are intentional about in your life? Like what happens is for too much of life, we go through doing things by default, not really thinking about stuff, not being intentional. Like in my own case, I certainly realized that I used to let friendships drift and not make an effort to keep people close to me, and all of these things require some work. At some level, even when it comes to something like fatherhood, some people could just do it in default mode and with the roles that society gives you, and the mother does most of the work, and etc. etc. But some people, and I'm pretty sure it's true of you, would put in work into it and think about it. What does it involve? What do I have to be, etc. etc. So how have these things changed you, and what are you intentional about in your life?
So I think that both these, they're precious to me, right? So, friendships, I think I have really a lot of friends, and I'll go back to my colony friends. I think it's just so relaxing, because we're all now in our late 50s, early 60s, a couple of younger people in their 40s and early 50s. And what I like about our Sunday Addas is that, you may be anybody. You may be the best neurosurgeon in the city. You may be the photographer who is, most sought after in Hindi film industry. But there you are treated just like, as if you're a nobody. And if anybody tries to boast or something, it doesn't take much time for old friends to pull you down. So I think that sort of healthy friendship, which has sustained over the years, I think that is very precious, to me. Of course, I have friends, again, professional friends. I have, friends from college. But I think to me, like friendship is the second thing, before I come to, two things before I come to fatherhood. I think one is I generally like to be around younger people, because I think I learn a lot, So I know you asked me this question about mentorship, etc. But I think it's a two-way street, Amit, because what I have learned from the likes of Pramit or Roshan or Siddharth Singh or, Kunal, so many, means Vikram, I think is, so it's not that it's some, one-way street that, oh, you've sort of helped them in their, I think I've learned so much. I continue to learn, I mean, I call them up for so many things. I read what they write. So I think that's one big thing, that you shouldn't ever slip into this zone of nostalgia that, oh, I come from a golden age and now everything is shit. I just don't buy that. And I think I learned that from my parents. As I said, they welcomed newer, like when Dalit poetry came in, when sort of what they call Gramin poetry or Gramin Katha, means village, from rural short stories. I think that's very important. The other thing I think, since you're asking me difficult questions, man, I think that I have come to the sort of conclusion, but I see the point that the small things in life matter. I mean, so much of our life is based on grandstanding of economic ideas, political ideas, this thing, that thing. And I say, what I really you enjoy eventually is as I said, sitting on the sidelines of Shivaji Park and watching a Kanga League match,
Or a cutting chai with your friends.
Or cutting chai with a friend, or sometimes, if they're up to it, a beer, just spending time with your family, or just, eating good food. I think some of this, or just, listening to a good piece of music, I think some of this to me is very important. I refuse to reduce my life down to the books I have read or the articles I have written. About fatherhood, I don't know. This is something which, since you're, being troublesome, maybe you should ask Saili. But I think I have been an attentive father. But I think my daughters are now in their 20s, means 25 and 28. And unfortunately, both are economists, but family curse. But I think that again, the same point. I think there was a time when the relationship switched, and now I actually learn more from my daughters. Means they are the ones who tell me, Baba, you must see this film, or, this is this new restaurant, let's go. So I think the dynamic also, so you have to basically be friends, with your children. I sort of, right from their childhood, I would read whatever they read. I would watch all the cartoons they watched. Not all, but whatever work schedules allow me. Currently, I'm watching an anime series on volleyball. But anyway, so, but that's it, So I think family is, just not father, though, the F is family. I think for me, it means a lot.
If any of Niranjan's daughters are listening to this, my request to them is please go to Niranjan and tell him, Baba, please write a book, or Baba, please do Marathi videos, or something like that, because there is, so much rich insight you have on so many things, and I wish you'd share more of it with the world. And since you are such a polite and graceful man that you will not forcibly get up till I let you, I will ask you one more question, two-part question.
Finally, final, as Yes Minister says.
Finally, final. Okay, yeah. Which is, a man who's worked a lot with the state will of course think of Yes Minister, which is that if there are and it's actually two questions in one. I didn't want to sort of intimidate you, but if there are young economists listening to this, A, and if there are young journalists listening to this, B, what would your advice to them be? And I don't mean this in a general sense of giving feel-good life advice, but these are both critical because, for example, with economists, our mutual friend Ajay has this very strong and deeply held view that most economists today are sort of, following traditional paths without thinking about them too much, and they're wasting their life chasing small problems, and they should really devote themselves to the country and go after bigger problems, and etc., etc. And at another level, that might also appear to be impractical because, what the hell? So there are pulls and pressures either ways. So your advice to young economists and young journalists?
Well, I would say to young economists, I think one is just as training. I think it's very important these days to understand the quantitative techniques very well. I think that's means as you said, economics is a social science. It is about human behavior, but I think the quantitative revolution which has happened is important. I think they should read a lot of economic history. I think, as I said, the art is as important as the science. The third thing I would say is that, understand economic data. I think what happens is that, I think Pramit writes about this very often, right? That you're working with data. So you have to understand how data is collected, what it means. Sometimes what I see is that because you have now access to statistical programs and you have access to computing power, it's very easy to quickly do a regression, etc. But I think unless you understand what the data is about, what you're trying to understand, I think that's important. And fourth is, I always feel that economists should sometimes leave their offices and go out and, see the real world. I think, why do people make choices? Like, I think, although I'm a skeptic of the RCT business, I think one of Abhijit Banerjee's point in Poor Economics is that, people make rational choices, means why do, I think some Morocco or something, he was stunned that people at the edge of poverty had TV antennas. Why are they spending money on televisions when they can't eat food? And he says that, the lives of the poor are very boring, means it's a very rational thing to make their lives, give meaning to their lives. So I think actually, going out and seeing the real world helps a lot. I think to young journalists, I would say that I think journalism is under attack, and the general idea is that nothing is done, everything is of a poor quality. I don't believe it. I still know lots and lots of very talented young journalists. So journalism is in a thing of transition, but I think it's a worthwhile career, and if you enjoy writing, if you enjoy, it's a rare privilege. Somebody's paying you to follow your curiosity, which, who does it, means you can basically, use that. So I think it's a thing. I think you have to understand, though, that the audience has changed, the technology has changed, so you have to adapt a lot, But I'll tell you again, going back to the Mint experience, Amit, I don't think that people only want dumbed down thing or only want sound bites. There is a demand for, you can always carve a niche. Means your own podcast is an example. But again, I've mentioned Rohit Lamba before. Rohit Lamba wrote a profile of Dilip Ebru, who I think at that point of time very few people knew about, right? It turned out to be one of the most read op-eds in Mint. So I think there is a demand for quality. So if you can stick to the path of quality, I think there are editors. Like I mentioned Sukumar, and I'm quite sure there are lots of others who appreciate good work, who are going to back you.
Wise words and optimistic words to end on. Niranjan, thanks so much, boss. You've spent the whole day here today. I'm so grateful.
I know. Thanks, Amit. It's been a long time since we actually caught up.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, share it with whoever you think might be interested. Check out the show notes, enter rabbit holes at will. You can follow Niranjan on Twitter at Cafe Economics. You can follow me at Amit Varma, AMITVARMA. You can browse past episodes of The Seen and the Unseen at seenunseen.in and every podcast app of your choice. Thank you for listening. Did you enjoy this episode of The Seen and the Unseen? If so, would you like to support the production of the show? You can go over to seenunseen.in/support and contribute any amount you like to keep this podcast alive and kicking. Thank you.